At my son's wedding, his bride pushed my wife into the mud in front of 400 guests. My son put his arm around her and whispered something that made her laugh. I simply walked to the microphone and said something no one in that room was expecting. Her own father set down his champagne glass. The band stopped playing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. I am Howard Jenkins. I am 69 years old, and for decades I ran a small repair shop to teach my son the value of hard work. I never told him I actually owned the logistics empire behind it. The late afternoon sun bathed the Napa Valley estate in a golden hue. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of crushed grapes and expensive perfume. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated silently among the 400 guests, their silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes. I stood near the edge of the grand patio watching the elite of California high society mingle. My wife Evelyn knelt on the manicured grass near the edge of a decorative stone fountain. Her hands, calloused from decades of quiet labor, carefully smoothed the intricate lace train of our new daughter-in-law Megan. Evelyn had spent the last 3 months sewing that lace by hand. She wanted everything to be perfect for Kendall. She wanted Megan to feel welcomed into our family. Gregory Whitmore, Megan's father, stood a few yards away holding a glass of vintage wine. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than the first tow truck I ever bought. He did not look at me. He did not look at Evelyn. His gaze swept over us as if we were part of the landscaping staff hired for the event. I adjusted my simple suit jacket, ignoring the cold stares from Megan's relatives. I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. I wanted Kendall to have the perfect day he had obsessed over for months. Megan turned sharply to greet a group of her former sorority sisters. Her sudden movement caught the heavy silk of her gown on the edge of her own stiletto heel. The fabric pulled tight. Instead of stepping back to untangle herself, Megan jerked her leg violently. She lost her balance for a fraction of a second. Her immediate reaction was not to catch herself, but to find a scapegoat. She spun around, her face twisting with sudden explosive rage. She shoved Evelyn hard in the chest with both hands. The force of the push caught my wife completely off guard. Evelyn stumbled backward, her arms flailing as her heels slipped on the wet grass bordering the water feature. She fell squarely into the decorative mud basin surrounding the fountain base. The dark, thick sludge splashed up instantly, soaking the soft pink dress she had bought specifically for this occasion. The impact echoed loudly over the soft jazz playing in the background. The sudden silence that fell over the courtyard was deafening. 400 pairs of eyes turned toward the fountain. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited for the immediate rush of apologies. I waited for Megan to gasp, to reach down to help the woman who had spent countless hours perfecting that very wedding dress. Instead, Megan looked down at Evelyn with absolute disgust. She brushed her hands together, frantic to ensure no dirt had touched her flawless manicure. She muttered a harsh complaint about clumsy people ruining her photos. Kendall was standing only 2 feet away. He had seen the entire exchange. He had seen the violent shove. He had seen his mother land in the cold mud. I watched my son, the boy I had taught to walk, the man whose private school tuition I had paid by working 18-hour shifts in a grease-stained garage. He did not bend down to help his mother. He did not ask if she was hurt. Kendall stepped right over Evelyn's legs, avoiding the mud entirely. He wrapped his arm tightly around Megan's waist, pulled her close, and whispered something into her ear. Megan threw her head back and laughed, a clear, ringing sound of mockery. A ripple of suppressed laughter spread through the Whitmore guests. They covered their mouths, hiding their amusement behind crystal glasses. That laughter shattered the final illusion I held about my son. I walked forward, my boots heavy against the stone pathway. I knelt in the mud, ignoring the dirt seeping into my trousers. I gently took Evelyn by the arms and lifted her to her feet. She was trembling. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the dark sludge from her cheek. I brushed the mud off the delicate pink fabric of her ruined dress. I looked into her eyes, seeing the quiet devastation of a mother realizing her son was gone. I squeezed her hand. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene of physical violence. I turned and marched straight to the bandstand. The jazz quintet was slowly trying to start playing again to cover the awkward tension. I stepped onto the wooden platform and pulled the microphone cable directly from the stand. The sharp screech of audio feedback cut through the air. Everyone stopped. Every conversation ceased. I locked eyes with Gregory Whitmore, then shifted my gaze to Kendall and his new bride. My voice boomed through the massive speakers, calm, steady, and utterly ruthless. This reception cost $200,000. The credit card paying for it was deactivated 60 seconds ago. The Whitmore family has exactly half an hour to settle the bill with the venue manager. Gregory Whitmore lowered his champagne glass, his face draining of all color. Megan let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Kendall stepped forward, his mouth opening in shock, but no words came out. The band members slowly lowered their instruments. I dropped the microphone onto the wooden stage. The heavy thud echoed across the manicured lawn. I walked back to Evelyn. I wrapped my arm securely around her shoulders. We walked right past the stunned guests down the grand driveway and got into my beat-up Ford truck. I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, shattering the pristine quiet of the Napa Valley estate. I put it in gear and drove away, leaving them to pay for a lifestyle they never earned. The drive back down the winding Napa Valley roads offered nothing but a heavy, suffocating silence. Rain began to speckle the windshield of my old Ford truck. Beside me, Evelyn sat perfectly still. She stared out the passenger window, her hands resting quietly on her lap. Every few minutes, she reached down to gently rub her right knee. The dark mud from the fountain basin had dried into a thick crust across the delicate pink fabric of her dress. She did not cry. She did not complain. Her silence cut deeper than any scream or tear ever could have. I gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. My mind drifted back 20 years. I remembered the exact smell of motor oil and burnt rubber the day I handed over the keys to my very first tow truck. That truck was the foundation of everything I built, but I sold it without a single second of hesitation. I needed the cash to cover Kendall's freshman tuition at the most prestigious private academy in the state. I wanted my son to walk through doors that had always been slammed in my face. I wanted him to sit in classrooms with the children of judges and corporate bankers to learn their language, to master their game. I wore grease-stained coveralls for decades so he could wear tailored suits. I endured the whispers and the side eyes from the white elite so my boy would never have to. Looking at Evelyn's bruised knee, I realized the bitter truth. My sacrifice did not buy his success. It simply bought his arrogance. I taught him how to conquer their world, but I completely forgot to teach him how to protect his own blood. The sharp buzzing of my cell phone shattered the quiet inside the truck cabin. It vibrated relentlessly against the center console. I ignored the first 5 incoming calls. Then the text messages started flooding the screen in rapid succession. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the highway, threw the transmission into park, and picked up the device. The messages were all from Kendall. There was no apology for his bride shoving his mother into the dirt. There was no inquiry regarding Evelyn's physical well-being. Instead, the screen displayed a frantic, aggressive rant. He accused me of destroying his reputation in front of the most powerful families in California. He claimed my stunt at the microphone had made him a complete laughingstock in Gregory Whitmore's social circle. The final message made my blood run entirely cold. Kendall demanded an immediate wire transfer of $100,000 directly to Gregory's corporate holding account. He called it compensation for the massive public humiliation I caused his new in-laws. He stated clearly that if the money was not in the account by Monday morning, he would legally sever all ties with us. He promised we would never see him again and we would never meet our future grandchildren. He dared to use his presence in our lives as a bargaining chip, holding our familial bond hostage for a massive financial payout. He believed I was just a stubborn old mechanic who would eventually cave to keep his only son around. He thought his ultimate threat would bring me to my knees in desperation. He was entirely wrong. The time for blind parental indulgence ended the very moment Evelyn hit the mud. I put the truck back in gear and drove the rest of the way in absolute calculated focus. We pulled into our modest driveway just as the rain began to fall harder against the pavement. I walked Evelyn to the front door, unlocked it, and helped her out of her ruined dress. I drew a warm bath for her, making sure she had everything she needed to wash away the physical traces of the afternoon's profound disgrace. Once she was comfortable and settled, I walked directly into my home office. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it securely behind me. The threat Kendall issued required an immediate clinical response. I refused to let my family's survival be dictated by a greedy son and his entitled new family. My sole priority was Evelyn. She was scheduled for a critical heart valve replacement surgery in exactly 3 weeks. I had meticulously set aside $85,000 in a dedicated private medical account to cover the top-tier surgical team and her subsequent recovery care facility. I sat down at my desk and booted up my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. I opened my private banking portal. My intention was straightforward and final. I needed to move the surgery funds into a secure offshore trust account, immediately placing the money entirely out of reach of any domestic legal maneuvers Kendall or Gregory might attempt. I typed in my credentials, bypassed the security prompts, and accessed the medical fund dashboard. I prepared to execute the wire transfer that would secure my wife's future. I reached for the mouse, ready to finalize the safety net I had built for the woman I loved. The screen loaded the account overview. I stared at the bold black numbers displayed across the top of the monitor. My breath caught in my throat. The available balance read exactly $0. I blinked rapidly, thoroughly convinced the banking portal was experiencing a technical glitch. I refreshed the secure page. The zero remained staring back at me like a hollow, mocking threat. My pulse pounded in my ears as I quickly navigated to the detailed transaction history tab. The ledger showed a single massive withdrawal. The entire $85,000 had been drained from the account. I checked the digital timestamp. The transaction was executed at 9 a.m, just 4 hours before the wedding ceremony began. I clicked on the digital wire transfer receipt to view the authorization details. The routing numbers matched an external commercial holding account. I scanned down to the bottom of the digital document to see the required authorization signature. My stomach plummeted to the floor. The withdrawal was legally processed using a joint medical mandate form. The signature at the bottom belonged to Evelyn. Someone had presented a legally binding power of attorney to the bank, granting them full, uncontested access to the emergency medical funds. Evelyn had not been near a bank in weeks. She had been completely consumed with preparing for the wedding. The realization struck me with the terrifying force of a physical blow. The missing money meant Evelyn's critical surgery was completely unfunded. Someone had methodically planned to strip us of our most critical financial lifeline on the exact day we were distracted by the celebration. The theft was precise, ruthless, and executed perfectly. I sat in the silent room staring at the forged digital signature, realizing the real war had started long before the wedding reception. The digital receipt on the screen glowed with an eerie, unforgiving light. $85,000 meant for Evelyn's heart valve replacement had vanished into an external commercial holding account. I did not waste time staring at the screen. I immediately picked up the phone and dialed the direct emergency line for my bank manager, a man named Arthur who had handled my hidden accounts for over 20 years. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy from sleep. I did not apologize for the late hour. I demanded to know exactly how a massive withdrawal was processed from a restricted medical fund without my secondary authorization. Arthur pulled up the file on his home computer. He explained that Kendall had walked into the main branch that morning, completely bypassing my standard protocols. He presented a fully notarized medical power of attorney signed by Evelyn, granting him absolute authority over her healthcare finances. The document was airtight, completely legally binding, and processed right before the bank closed for the weekend. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Evelyn would never willingly sign away her surgery money. She knew exactly what that fund represented. I pressed Arthur for the specific date on the notarized document. He confirmed it was signed exactly 3 weeks ago. The timeline aligned perfectly, snapping a horrific puzzle into place. 3 weeks ago, Evelyn had been admitted to the hospital for a minor preliminary procedure, a routine catheterization required before her major surgery. She had been under mild anesthesia. She had been groggy, confused, and vulnerable. I remembered pacing the waiting room, anxious for the doctor's update. Kendall had arrived unexpectedly, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a stack of insurance paperwork. He told me he was handling the administrative hospital forms to save me the headache. He insisted on sitting with his mother while I went to grab coffee. I had thanked him. I had actually thanked my son for being responsible. Now the truth was glaringly obvious. Kendall had slipped that medical power of attorney into the middle of the standard hospital consent forms. He had manipulated his own mother while she was heavily sedated, guiding her hand to sign away her life-saving funds. He had carefully planned this theft weeks in advance, ensuring the withdrawal would go completely unnoticed until the wedding day chaos provided the perfect cover. The betrayal was not a moment of weakness or a sudden act of desperation. It was a calculated, predatory strike against the woman who gave him life. He viewed her heart surgery not as a medical necessity, but as a convenient source of liquid cash for his new family. I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. I walked quietly into the master bedroom. Evelyn was fast asleep, her breathing steady but fragile. The mud from the wedding had been washed away, but the emotional stain of that afternoon lingered in the exhausted lines of her face. I pulled the blanket up over her shoulders, ensuring she was warm. I did not wake her. She needed rest, and I needed absolute focus. I grabbed my heavy wool coat from the closet and grabbed my keys. I walked out to my truck, the cold rain still lashing against the windshield. I drove through the empty, slick streets of the city, bypassing the local police station entirely. Calling the police meant opening a slow, bureaucratic investigation that would tip off Kendall and Gregory. I needed immediate surgical precision. I drove straight to the downtown office building of Jonathan Hayes, my private corporate attorney. Jonathan was the only man alive who knew the full extent of my wealth. He answered my call from the lobby and buzzed me up to his penthouse suite. I walked into his office past midnight, shaking the rain from my coat. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the digital printouts of the fraudulent transaction and explained Kendall's manipulation of the medical power of attorney. Jonathan reviewed the documents, his face hardening into a mask of professional outrage. He immediately accessed the bank's secure portal to trace the routing number of the external commercial account where the stolen funds had landed. Jonathan's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up corporate registries and property deeds linked to the receiving account. The silence in the office stretched out, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the massive glass windows. After 10 minutes, Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he pulled a thick red folder from his filing cabinet and slid it across the glass desk toward me. He looked me squarely in the eye. He stated that the stolen $85,000 was a devastating blow, but it was only the surface of a much larger catastrophic financial maneuver. Jonathan explained that the receiving account belonged to a failing commercial real estate venture completely owned by Gregory Whitmore. Gregory's company was drowning in toxic debt and facing imminent collapse, but the stolen cash was not enough to save Gregory. It was merely a down payment to secure a massive high-risk loan. Jonathan tapped the red folder. He revealed that Kendall had used the forged power of attorney to do much more than drain cash. Kendall had legally pledged the deed to my home, the very house where Evelyn was currently sleeping, as the primary collateral to underwrite Gregory Whitmore's failing real estate project. The paperwork had already been processed. If Gregory's company defaulted on the loan, the bank would immediately foreclose on my property. Kendall had not just stolen his mother's surgery money, he had effectively sold the roof over our heads to buy his way into a bankrupt family. I sat in the leather chair opposite Jonathan and stared at the documents proving my son had mortgaged the roof over his mother's head. The initial shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I did not raise my voice or slam my fist against the glass desk. Anger is an emotion for men who lack options. I simply leaned forward and gave my attorney a single definitive directive. I instructed Jonathan to launch a comprehensive, ruthless forensic audit of the entire Whitmore enterprise immediately. I wanted every shell company, every hidden bank account, every offshore trust, and every unpaid tax lien brought into the light by sunrise. Jonathan nodded, his fingers already typing rapid commands into his secure terminal to summon his top financial investigators. He knew I had the capital to fund an army of forensic accountants without flinching. We needed to map out the exact architecture of Gregory Whitmore's financial house of cards before taking a single retaliatory strike. My home was currently tethered to a sinking ship, and my wife's life-saving surgery fund was sitting in a hostile corporate account. I needed absolute leverage to sever those ties without triggering a catastrophic default that would leave Evelyn homeless. Jonathan deployed his team, tapping into private corporate registries and pulling credit default records that the public never sees. I watched the digital files begin to populate on the large monitor mounted on the office wall. Every line of code, every flagged transaction was a weapon I was preparing to load. I was no longer an aggrieved father trying to understand a rebellious son. I was a businessman dismantling a hostile corporate takeover targeting my family. Gregory Whitmore and his high society guests saw me exactly how I wanted them to see me. They saw an aging African-American mechanic who spent 40 years smelling of diesel fuel and exhaust fumes. They saw the tiny, grease-stained repair shop on the industrial side of town and assumed that was the absolute limit of my life's achievement. They were entirely wrong. That small repair shop was merely the original cornerstone of a massive corporate structure. It served as a brilliant, unassuming front for a tri-state commercial logistics empire that I built from the ground up and fully owned. I controlled a fleet of 600 freight trucks moving goods across the entire western seaboard, holding multi-million-dollar contracts with major retailers. I hid the true magnitude of my wealth for a very specific, deliberate reason. I wanted Kendall to forge his own path to earn his own victories without using my shadow as a crutch. I knew the unforgiving reality of the corporate world. A young black man walking into elite boardrooms relying on his father's hidden bank accounts would never command genuine respect. They would tolerate his money, but always view him as an inferior interloper. I wanted my son to have the hunger and the sharp edge that only comes from starting at the bottom. I kept the blue-collar facade intact to force him to build a legacy that could never be dismissed or attributed to nepotism. I gave him the finest education, but I refused to hand him an unearned throne. Instead of learning resilience, Kendall absorbed the toxic arrogance of the wealthy circles I paid for him to enter. My greatest lesson in humility had bred the ultimate entitlement. The printer in the corner of Jonathan's office began to hum, spitting out the preliminary results of the aggressive financial sweep. Jonathan gathered the warm pages and laid them out in a grid across the desk. The narrative they painted was a masterpiece of desperation and fraud. Gregory Whitmore was not a titan of commercial real estate. He was a drowning man gasping for his final breath. His primary holding company was over-leveraged by millions of dollars, staggering under the weight of toxic loans and consecutive failed development projects. The banks were actively preparing to seize his flagship properties. The lavish Napa Valley wedding was never a celebration of love between two young people. It was a carefully orchestrated smokescreen designed to project an illusion of immense liquidity and untouchable power. Gregory needed fresh, uncontested capital to appease his most aggressive creditors and stave off total bankruptcy. He recognized my son's desperate craving for upper-class validation and used Megan to reel him in. Kendall was nothing more than an easy, eager mark. Gregory manipulated my son into signing those fraudulent loan guarantees using my house as the collateral Gregory severely lacked. The $85,000 stolen from Evelyn's medical fund was immediately absorbed to cover Gregory's payroll and stop a labor strike at a stalled construction site. They bled my family dry to artificially inflate a dying empire for a few more weeks. Gregory thought he had outsmarted a naive mechanic. He did not realize he had just invited a titan of logistics into his accounting books. The sheer audacity of the theft solidified my resolve completely. I instructed Jonathan to begin drafting the legal countermeasures immediately. I needed ironclad injunctions to freeze the transfer of my property deed before Gregory's creditors could lock onto it. As Jonathan began dictating swift commands to his paralegal team, my phone vibrated sharply against the glass tabletop. It was not another text message demanding money. It was an urgent push notification from my home security system. The application indicated a severe perimeter breach at my primary residence. Evelyn was still asleep inside, recovering from the physical shock of the afternoon. I opened the live video feed on my screen. The high-definition night vision camera mounted above my driveway provided a clear, chilling image. The torrential rain was coming down in sheets, turning the quiet suburban street into a slick, dark mirror. Standing directly outside my reinforced steel security gate was Kendall. He was completely soaked, his expensive tailored tuxedo clinging to his frame. His face was contorted in absolute rage. He gripped a heavy steel tire iron in his right hand. I watched in real time as my son raised the heavy metal bar and violently smashed it against the electronic keypad of the security gate. Sparks showered the wet pavement as the plastic casing shattered into pieces. He struck the solid metal bars, repeatedly screaming words the microphone struggled to pick up over the sound of the pounding storm. He was trying to force his way onto the property. He had come to finish what he started, demanding the final surrender of my assets. I grabbed my keys, thanked Jonathan, and walked out into the cold night. The time for gathering intelligence was over. The physical confrontation had arrived at my doorstep. The drive from Jonathan's downtown office back to my suburban neighborhood took exactly 22 minutes. The torrential rain hammered relentlessly against the metal roof of my Ford truck, washing the empty city streets in a blurry, distorted glow. I turned the final corner and the headlights of my vehicle illuminated the chaotic scene at the boundary of my property. My son was still there. Kendall stood ankle-deep in a rising puddle, his expensive tuxedo soaked entirely through, plastering the dark fabric to his skin. He swung the heavy steel tire iron again, striking the shattered remnants of the electronic keypad with a sickening crunch. The metal gate rattled violently on its hinges, but the reinforced locking mechanism held firm against the assault. I did not honk the horn. I did not yell from the safety of the cabin. I parked the truck directly behind his sleek rented sports car, blocking his escape path completely. I killed the engine and pushed the heavy driver's side door open. The cold wind bit into my bones instantly. The icy rain soaked my suit jacket within seconds. I stepped onto the slick asphalt and walked slowly toward the gate. The steady rhythm of my boots against the wet ground finally caught his attention. Kendall froze his chest, heaving as he gasped for air in the freezing downpour. He turned around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The tire iron slipped from his trembling grip, clattering loudly against the flooded pavement. We stood exactly 5 feet apart, separated only by the heavy iron bars of the gate. Kendall lunged toward the iron bars, gripping the wet metal with both hands. His voice tore through the heavy downpour, shrill and dripping with venom. He screamed that my stunt at the reception had triggered a cascading financial disaster. The luxury hotel in Bora Bora had canceled their honeymoon reservation the moment the primary credit card was declined. The international airline flagged their first-class tickets for immediate fraud. Gregory Whitmore's banking contacts had instantly been notified of the frozen accounts, throwing his entire real estate firm into a state of absolute panic. Kendall blamed me entirely for the sudden collapse of his perfect new life. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded stack of thick, water-resistant legal paper. He thrust the documents through the gaps in the iron gate, waving them frantically in my face. It was a commercial transfer deed specifically drafted to strip me of my only visible asset. He produced a silver pen from his pocket, shoving it toward me with erratic, jerky movements. He demanded my signature right there in the rain. He explained the twisted logic of his desperation. Gregory's company needed immediate, unencumbered liquid collateral to secure a massive bridge loan by Monday morning. Kendall commanded me to sign over the total ownership of the repair shop immediately. He claimed the commercial land the shop sat on was worth just enough to satisfy Gregory's aggressive creditors temporarily. He genuinely believed that the small, grease-stained garage was the absolute sum of my financial worth. He justified the theft of his mother's heart surgery money as a temporary necessary loan to stabilize the Whitmore accounts, promising he would pay it back with interest once Gregory's real estate developments turned a massive profit. He stood in the pouring rain, ordering me to sacrifice 40 years of my hard labor to bail out a man who had treated me like a servant just hours earlier. Kendall expected total submission. He expected the quiet, accommodating father who had always paid his elite tuition, bought his luxury cars, and smoothed over his reckless mistakes. He demanded I surrender my livelihood to salvage the social standing he so desperately craved. The absolute arrogance of his demand hung in the cold air, heavier than the violent storm itself. I looked at the crumpled commercial deed trembling in his hand. I did not reach for the silver pen. I looked my son directly in the eye and delivered a single, flat refusal. I told him clearly that I would rather burn the shop to the ground than sign it over to a thief. The word hit Kendall like a physical blow. His expression twisted from frantic desperation into pure, unadulterated hatred. He pulled his hands back through the gate, gripping the cold iron bars until his knuckles turned white. He spat a vicious curse onto the wet pavement at my feet. He screamed that I was a pathetic, small-minded embarrassment to him. He called me a grease-stained failure who had spent his entire life hiding in a filthy garage because I was too cowardly to succeed in the real world. He declared that I did not deserve to have a son who had ascended to the ranks of high society. He stated that Gregory Whitmore was twice the man I was, a visionary who actually understood wealth, power, and legacy. Kendall systematically tore down every sacrifice I had ever made for him, reducing my life's work to a source of deep personal shame. He yelled that Evelyn's surgery money was better spent securing a real corporate future instead of prolonging a miserable, insignificant existence. His words confirmed that the boy I raised was entirely dead. The man standing before me was a parasite. Before I could issue a response to his venomous tirade, a blinding set of halogen headlights swept across the wet street. A sleek black SUV accelerated around the corner, its heavy tires screeching against the flooded asphalt. The massive vehicle swerved aggressively toward the curb and slammed to a halt directly behind my parked truck. The heavy passenger door swung open. Megan stepped out into the driving rain. She no longer wore the pristine lace wedding gown from the afternoon. She was dressed in a sharp, dark trench coat, her face a rigid mask of calculated hostility. She marched past her husband without offering him a single glance of support. She stopped right at the iron gate, standing shoulder to shoulder with Kendall. She reached into her deep coat pocket and withdrew a thick, official-looking document housed inside a clear plastic sleeve. She did not yell like Kendall. Her voice was icy, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of human empathy. She shoved her arm through the iron bars and violently slapped the plastic sleeve directly against my chest. The document fell to the wet pavement, landing face up in the water. It was a certified psychiatric evaluation bearing the official seal of a prominent state medical board. Megan stared at me with dead, predatory eyes. She articulated her threat with absolute precision. She stated clearly that the document declared I was suffering from severe early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She informed me that my actions at the wedding were classified as a violent, irrational, psychotic break. She leaned closer to the cold iron bars, her lips curling into a triumphant, wicked sneer. She announced that they were taking the evaluation to a federal judge and filing for immediate total legal guardianship over me tomorrow morning. I held the clear plastic sleeve under the dim yellow light of the porch fixture. The rain hammered against the roof, but my focus remained entirely on the bold black text stamped across the official medical letterhead. The document bore the signature of a Dr. Eris Thorne, a prominent psychiatrist I had never met or spoken to in my entire 69 years of life. According to the rain-soaked pages, Dr. Thorne had conducted a comprehensive evaluation of my mental faculties and conclusively diagnosed me with severe, rapidly advancing early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The text outlined a completely fabricated narrative provided directly by my son. Kendall had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from severe memory lapses, violent mood swings, and a total inability to manage basic financial decisions. The report cited my calm action at the wedding reception as a textbook example of a dangerous psychotic break brought on by cognitive decline. The strategy was devious and impeccably timed. Gregory Whitmore had clearly utilized his vast payroll to purchase a corrupt medical professional. A certified declaration of mental incompetence from a licensed state physician provided the exact legal foundation they needed to bypass standard foreclosure procedures. They did not need me to willingly sign the commercial transfer deed for the repair shop. If a federal judge granted Kendall and Megan immediate legal guardianship based on this forged medical evidence, they would gain unchecked, absolute control over my entire life. They could legally liquidate my assets, seize my property, and force me into a locked memory care facility against my will. Kendall and Megan stood beyond the iron gate, their faces twisted into triumphant smirks, fully believing they had orchestrated a flawless checkmate. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. I did not scream into the cold night. I did not hurl insults at the son I had raised or the woman he had chosen to marry. Anger is a predictable reaction, and predictable men are incredibly easy to defeat. I simply folded the damp plastic sleeve in half and tucked it securely into the inside pocket of my wetsuit jacket. I turned my back on Kendall and Megan without uttering a single word. I walked up the driveway, letting the heavy rain wash over my shoulders. I stepped through the front entrance, pushed the heavy oak door shut, and engaged the steel deadbolt. The sudden quiet of the foyer enveloped me. Evelyn remained safely asleep in the master bedroom, entirely unaware of the predators circling our home. I stripped off my soaked jacket and draped it over a chair in my office. I sat down at my desk in the pitch-black room. I needed to process the sheer magnitude of the threat. They were actively weaponizing the legal and medical systems to completely erase my autonomy. Their arrogance blinded them to one crucial fact. They assumed I was a helpless old mechanic with no resources to fight back. I remained awake until the first light of dawn cracked the horizon. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford while my freedom was actively under siege. I opened my laptop and bypassed my standard contacts. Fighting a corrupt doctor in my own state would take weeks of bureaucratic delays, time Gregory Whitmore would use to drain my accounts dry. I needed immediate, unassailable medical proof from untouchable sources. Using the encrypted communication network tied to my logistics empire, I contacted 3 independent board-certified neurologists located in a neighboring state. These were not local physicians easily swayed by Gregory's political donations. They were leading experts at top-tier research hospitals. I authorized massive non-refundable emergency retainer fees from a hidden corporate offshore account to secure immediate appointments for that very morning. Before Evelyn woke up, I left a gentle note on the kitchen counter explaining I had an urgent out-of-town meeting for the repair shop. I drove across the state line just as the sun crested the hills. Over the next 8 hours, I submitted myself to the most rigorous, high-level cognitive examinations available in modern medicine. I underwent comprehensive MRI brain scans, complex psychological evaluations, and extensive memory retention testing under the strict supervision of 3 separate medical teams. I answered every detailed question with absolute clarity. I solved complex spatial reasoning puzzles and recalled dense sequences of information without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I subjected my mind to total scrutiny to build an impenetrable wall of evidence. By late afternoon, all three leading specialists provided identical, heavily notarized conclusions. My brain function was not just normal for my age. It was exceptionally sharp. They produced certified, time-stamped medical affidavits unequivocally declaring that I possessed zero signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or Alzheimer's disease. The forged diagnosis purchased by Gregory Whitmore was now completely neutralized by overwhelmingly superior medical authority. I held the three pristine medical certificates in my hands, feeling the cold weight of the paper. My mind was sharp-focused and entirely prepared to dismantle the false reality my son had tried to construct. I walked out of the final clinic, breathing the crisp air, ready to return home and crush their legal assault. I walked across the hospital parking lot and unlocked the door of my truck. Before I could turn the ignition key, my encrypted corporate cell phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was a direct call from Marcus Vance, the primary manager of my hidden corporate trust fund. Marcus was specifically instructed to only use that secure line during events of catastrophic financial exposure. I answered the call immediately, my voice sharp and ready for the update. Marcus did not waste time with standard greetings. He spoke with urgent, clipped precision. He informed me that Gregory Whitmore and Megan were currently standing inside the executive lobby of the Central State Bank. They had not waited for a judge to grant formal legal guardianship. They had boldly presented the forged psychiatric evaluation directly to the regional bank vice president as emergency proof of my mental incompetence. Gregory was leveraging his remaining social capital and the fraudulent medical document to demand immediate executive control over the core corporate accounts belonging to my logistics empire. They had somehow traced the ownership of the repair shop to the larger corporate umbrella and were attempting a hostile, unauthorized seizure of the primary corporate treasury. If the bank manager accepted the forged medical evaluation as valid, Gregory would gain instant access to millions of dollars in liquid capital. He would completely absorb my life's work to save his collapsing real estate venture before the day ended. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the three notarized certificates of perfect mental health resting on the passenger seat. My enemies were moving faster than anticipated, operating with breathtaking audacity. I ordered Marcus to stall the bank manager by any legal means necessary. I threw the truck into gear and sped toward the financial district. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the Central State Bank, stepping onto the polished marble floors. The cavernous room amplified every sound, echoing the frantic energy of the morning rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man entirely in control of his domain. Jonathan matched my stride on my right, clutching his leather briefcase. At the far end of the lobby, standing at the elevated executive teller station, was Gregory Whitmore. He leaned aggressively over the mahogany counter, slamming his palm flat against the wood. His voice bounced off the vaulted ceiling, demanding immediate compliance from the regional bank vice president, Arthur. Megan stood slightly behind her father, arms crossed tight over her chest, projecting an aura of bored impatience. Gregory jabbed a manicured finger at a stack of documents resting on the counter. He ordered Arthur to stop citing bureaucratic delays and process the corporate transfer immediately. He claimed he possessed total legal authority over my assets due to my sudden medical incapacitation. He threw his weight around, relying on his tailored suit and loud volume to intimidate the bank staff. The tellers in the adjacent lines paused their counting, shooting nervous glances toward the escalating commotion. Arthur stood his ground behind the counter, gripping the edge of his desk, clearly attempting to stall as I had instructed. Gregory raised his voice higher, threatening to have Arthur fired by the end of the day. I stopped 10 feet behind Gregory, maintaining absolute silence. The confrontation awaited. Gregory spun around, sensing my arrival. His face contorted from aggressive rage into a mask of cruel, triumphant amusement. He looked me up and down, taking in my damp clothes and weary posture from a night without sleep. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that carried across the entire lobby. He loudly announced to the room that the senile mechanic had somehow managed to find his way downtown. Gregory spread his arms wide, performing for the captive audience of bank tellers and terrified customers. He declared with absolute certainty that I was a broken, incompetent old fool suffering from advanced dementia. He pointed directly at my chest, raising his voice so every person in the building could hear his fabricated diagnosis. He stated that I had completely lost my grip on reality and belonged permanently locked away in a state-run psychiatric ward. He claimed my sudden appearance was clear proof of my erratic, dangerous mental deterioration. Megan stepped up beside her father, offering a theatrical sigh of fake pity. She told Arthur that my presence was exactly why they needed immediate access to the accounts, claiming they had to protect my assets from my own insane delusions. Gregory sneered, stepping directly into my personal space. He whispered that I was entirely out of my depth, completely outmatched by superior intellect and wealth. He mocked my lifelong dedication to manual labor, stating that a man who spent 40 years changing oil filters had no business controlling a massive corporate treasury. He demanded I step aside and let my betters handle the complexities of the financial world. He commanded Arthur to finalize the transfer immediately, citing the forged medical evaluation as absolute legal truth. Gregory stood with his chest puffed out, fully convinced he had successfully executed a flawless corporate coup right in front of my face. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I let him expend his energy, knowing that his loud desperation was born from his own impending bankruptcy. His performance was the thrashing of a cornered animal trying to project absolute dominance. Jonathan stepped smoothly around me, taking the exact physical space Gregory had just occupied. He did not engage in a shouting match. He operated with the lethal efficiency of a seasoned corporate litigator. He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out the 3 distinct, pristine medical certificates I had secured mere hours ago. Jonathan swiftly slapped the heavy notarized documents flat onto the mahogany counter right over Gregory's forged paperwork. The crisp sound cracked through the tense silence of the lobby. Jonathan spoke in a clear, authoritative tone that commanded absolute attention. He informed Gregory and the bank manager that the documents presented were emergency high-level cognitive evaluations conducted by 3 separate independent board-certified neurologists from a neighboring state. He pointed to the digital timestamps printed clearly at the bottom of each page, verifying they were executed that exact morning. Jonathan declared unequivocally that these comprehensive medical examinations proved Howard Jenkins possessed 0 signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or mental instability. He firmly stated that the evaluation Gregory possessed was a purchased forgery, a fraudulent instrument utilized to attempt the illegal seizure of corporate assets. Arthur picked up the 3 new certificates, adjusting his glasses to verify the official seals and signatures. The tension in Arthur's shoulders vanished entirely. He looked up at Gregory with a cold, professional glare. Arthur formally announced to the entire lobby that the bank was immediately rejecting the initial medical power of attorney due to conflicting and superior medical evidence. He explicitly revoked all of Gregory's temporary access privileges to the logistics empire's accounts. Arthur picked up the forged document, placed it in a secure tray, and informed Gregory that the bank's legal department would be retaining it as evidence of attempted financial fraud. Gregory's entire master plan collapsed in a matter of a few seconds. The immense fortune he desperately needed to save his dying real estate venture was instantly sealed behind an impenetrable vault. He was completely locked out, leaving his toxic business exposed to total ruin without any remaining financial lifeline to save his legacy. Gregory Whitmore stared directly at the rejected paperwork, his breathing growing ragged and uneven. The smug arrogance that had defined his posture moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a deep, visceral panic. The color drained from his cheeks before flushing back in a dark, mottled purple. The realization of his absolute financial failure hit him with the force of a freight train. Megan immediately backed away from the counter, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits as the bank security guards began to shift closer. She recognized a losing battle and immediately sought to distance herself from the fallout. Gregory, however, refused to surrender gracefully. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He leaned in, ensuring his voice was low enough to evade the security camera's microphones, but sharp enough to cut directly through the remaining tension. He whispered his final venomous threat directly into my face. He admitted that the logistics accounts were out of his reach, but he was not walking away empty-handed. Gregory stated with absolute malice that he had already legally leveraged Kendall's remaining shares and successfully utilized the forged property deed to secure the initial loan. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered his absolute ultimatum. I already leveraged Kendall's shares. I am foreclosing on your miserable repair shop on Friday. He quickly turned on his heel and stormed out of the bank, establishing the ultimate legal battleground for our impending war. The morning air carried a bitter chill as I drove my truck toward the industrial district. The familiar scent of motor oil and rusted metal usually brought me a deep sense of peace. Today the atmosphere felt entirely different. I parked across the street from the cinderblock building that had served as my sanctuary and my disguise for over 4 decades. I stepped out of the cabin and walked toward the heavy rolling bay doors. A bright yellow legal document was nailed directly into the weathered wood of the front entrance. It was a formal notice of foreclosure stamped with the seal of the county clerk. Gregory Whitmore had made his next aggressive maneuver. Using Kendall's fraudulently obtained signature and the forged power of attorney, Gregory had officially initiated the legal process to seize my commercial land. The sheer audacity of the move was staggering. He was bankrupt, drowning in his own financial incompetence, yet he believed he could simply swallow my property to satisfy his creditors. I stood on the cracked concrete, reading the legal jargon demanding my immediate eviction. Gregory assumed I would panic. He assumed I would desperately hire low-level attorneys to fight a drawn-out losing battle in municipal court. He expected me to scream, beg, and eventually surrender the very ground I built my life upon. I reached up and tore the yellow paper from the door. I folded it neatly along the creases and slid it into my pocket. I unlocked the heavy padlock, rolled up the steel door, and stepped inside the dark garage. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute icy clarity of a man preparing to dismantle his enemy from the inside out. I drove straight back to the financial district and walked directly into Jonathan Hayes's office. I dropped the crumpled foreclosure notice onto his pristine glass desk. He read the document quickly, his jaw tightening as he registered Gregory Whitmore's aggressive legal overreach. Jonathan immediately suggested filing an emergency injunction to block the property seizure, citing the highly fraudulent nature of the collateral agreement. I raised my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I explicitly ordered my attorney not to contest the foreclosure in any municipal court. Jonathan stared at me in profound confusion. Fighting Gregory in an open legal battle would only drag the process out for months, giving him precious time to maneuver and potentially hide his remaining assets. I flatly refused to play a defensive game. I instructed Jonathan to leverage the vast untraceable capital from my primary logistics empire and immediately establish a blind shell corporation. We required a highly secure corporate entity entirely disconnected from the Jenkins family name, operating beneath multiple layers of impenetrable corporate secrecy. Jonathan's initial confusion rapidly morphed into a sharp, predatory realization. He immediately grasped the sheer magnitude of my financial strategy. He opened his secure digital terminal and began rapidly drafting the incorporation documents for a new holding company. I verbally authorized the immediate transfer of $50 million in liquid capital directly into the newly formed entity. The money moved instantly through secure encrypted channels completely untraceable by any local financial institution. Within 3 short hours, the Phantom Corporation was fully operational and heavily capitalized. I laid out the precise parameters of my final directive. I did not want to fight Gregory Whitmore over a single insignificant piece of commercial land. I wanted to swallow his entire fabricated reality. I ordered Jonathan to deploy our specialized financial analysts to locate every single toxic loan, defaulted mortgage, and black market debt Gregory owed across the entire state. Gregory had built his lavish lifestyle by borrowing heavily from unforgiving corporate lenders and ruthless shadow financiers. His sprawling empire was entirely built on unsecured promises and massive, unsustainable liabilities. I fully intended to purchase every single one of those heavy liabilities in cold cash. Jonathan finalized the sophisticated corporate structure, his fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal efficiency. The trap was completely set. Gregory Whitmore firmly believed he was hunting a helpless mechanic. He had absolutely no idea a corporate leviathan was quietly encircling his entire existence. The execution of the strategy was brutally swift. Operating behind the impenetrable shield of the newly formed holding company, my financial team systematically approached Gregory Whitmore's primary creditors. The banks holding his underwater mortgages were desperate to offload the high-risk paper. The shadow lenders financing his black market debts were eager to recover their cash without resorting to violent collection methods. My shell corporation offered them an incredibly lucrative exit strategy. We purchased every single promissory note, every defaulted construction loan, and every leveraged corporate bond carrying Gregory's signature. We bought them all at a premium, ensuring complete cooperation and immediate transfer of ownership. Within 48 hours, the massive transactions were legally finalized and securely recorded. Gregory Whitmore was completely unaware that the financial ground beneath his feet had shifted entirely. He thought he owed money to a dozen fragmented institutions. He thought he could manipulate the system by playing his creditors against each other. He was entirely wrong. Every single piece of his toxic debt was now consolidated into a single portfolio. The Blind Shell Corporation held the absolute legal right to demand immediate repayment in full. Using the massive capital generated by my hidden logistics empire, I had successfully executed the ultimate financial encirclement. I did not merely hold the mortgage on Gregory Whitmore's lavish properties. I officially owned the bank that owned Gregory Whitmore. The man who had mocked my grease-stained hands was now my absolute financial subordinate. I returned home to find Evelyn resting quietly in the living room. The physical toll of the recent events weighed heavily upon her, but she maintained a quiet, enduring strength. I walked to the kitchen island and sifted through the daily mail delivery. Most of it consisted of mundane utility bills and local advertisements. At the very bottom of the stack, a thick, expensive square caught my attention. It was a heavy, gold-embossed envelope sealed with an elaborate wax stamp bearing the Whitmore family crest. I broke the seal and pulled out the thick cardstock invitation inside. The elegant calligraphy announced a lavish housewarming party hosted by Kendall and Megan at their newly purchased multi-million-dollar mansion. The date was set for the upcoming weekend. The invitation was not an olive branch. It was a calculated, vicious insult. Kendall knew exactly what the foreclosure notice on my repair shop meant. He knew the financial devastation he had supposedly unleashed upon me. He and Megan were deliberately inviting Evelyn and me to their massive estate to parade their stolen wealth right in front of our faces. They fully intended to publicly humiliate the aging bankrupt mechanic one last time in front of California's highest society. They wanted us to witness the glamorous life they built using my stolen home as collateral. I folded the heavy invitation and placed it firmly on the kitchen counter. I looked at the golden lettering shining under the overhead lights. I decided Evelyn and I would absolutely attend their lavish celebration. The towering iron gates of Kendall and Megan's newly purchased estate swung open to reveal a sweeping, circular driveway lined with imported Italian cypress trees. I parked my modest Ford truck directly between a gleaming Bentley and a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. A valet in a crisp white uniform hurried over his practiced smile, faltering slightly as he took my keys and assessed my vehicle. I stepped around the front bumper and offered my arm to Evelyn. She wore her best navy dress, her posture perfectly straight despite the lingering fatigue from her medical battles. We walked together up the wide marble steps and passed through the massive double doors of the mansion. The interior was a cathedral of newly acquired wealth featuring soaring vaulted ceilings and aggressive modern art completely devoid of soul. Megan waited in the grand foyer holding a flute of champagne. She wore a stunning silver evening gown that caught the light with every movement. When she saw us, her polite hostess smile morphed into a sharp, triumphant smirk. She did not offer a greeting or ask for our coats. She simply snapped her fingers, summoning a passing event coordinator. Megan instructed the young woman to escort us to our designated seats. We were led away from the sprawling main dining hall past the tables adorned with towering floral centerpieces and crystal glassware. The coordinator guided us into a narrow, dimly lit hallway adjacent to the bustling catering kitchen. Our assigned seating was a cheap plastic folding table squeezed tightly against a swinging metal door. We were entirely separated from the affluent guests positioned directly in the path of hurried waiters carrying dirty plates. Megan had orchestrated the seating chart with cruel precision. She intended to visually reduce us to the status of hired help within her own home. Evelyn took her seat on the hard metal folding chair without a single word of complaint. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes drifting toward the main hall where massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the elite crowd. I watched her face, searching for any sign of heartbreak or humiliation. Instead, I saw a profound, quiet strength. She stared at the glittering crystals and recalled a time when luxury was an entirely foreign concept to our family. She spoke softly over the clatter of the nearby kitchen, remembering the bitter winters she spent scrubbing grease-stained linoleum floors at a roadside diner on the edge of town. She worked triple shifts, destroying her knees and blistering her hands for minimum wage, driven by a singular, unwavering objective. Kendall had qualified for the state debate tournament, and he desperately needed to look the part of a formidable contender. Evelyn saved every crumpled dollar bill and loose coin in a glass jar hidden beneath our bed. She walked miles in the snow to purchase him a beautifully tailored charcoal suit, ensuring our son would never feel inferior standing at the podium. She literally scrubbed the foundation of his early confidence into existence. Now that same boy hosted a multi-million-dollar gala and relegated the woman who bought his first armor to the shadows of the scullery. Her sacrifice had bred the ultimate ingratitude. The sharp ringing of a crystal glass being struck by a silver spoon echoed from the main dining room, silencing the classical string quartet playing in the corner. I stood up from the folding table and stepped into the threshold of the swinging kitchen doors to observe the spectacle. Kendall stood at the head of the grand banquet table, clutching a microphone. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket, his face flushed with champagne and the intoxicating rush of unearned power. He welcomed the assembled corporate elites, state politicians, and shadow financiers to his new home. He raised his glass to Gregory Whitmore, loudly praising his father-in-law as a brilliant real estate visionary and a master of aggressive corporate expansion. Kendall paused, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto my position near the kitchen entrance. A cruel, arrogant smile spread across his face. He announced to the glittering crowd that the acquisition of his new estate was made possible by a recent, highly lucrative corporate takeover. He proudly declared that Whitmore Enterprises had successfully executed a hostile foreclosure on a prime piece of industrial real estate previously occupied by a dying, outdated mechanic shop. The crowd offered a polite smattering of applause, entirely unaware of the deeply personal nature of the transaction. Kendall leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. He mocked the archaic business model of exchanging physical labor for meager profits. He proclaimed that the future belonged to men who understood how to ruthlessly leverage assets, manipulate markets, and crush weak opposition. He publicly reduced my 40 years of relentless honest work to a pathetic cautionary tale of blue-collar stagnation. He toasted to the swift demolition of the old garage, promising that a lucrative luxury development would soon pave over the grease and failure of the past. He stood in the center of the room, basking in the admiration of Gregory's high society sycophants. Kendall truly believed he had permanently defeated me, cementing his legacy by destroying mine. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that the lavish roof over his head, the champagne in his glass, and the very ground he stood upon now belonged entirely to the man standing quietly by the kitchen doors. I returned to the folding table and calmly finished the remaining portion of my catered steak. The meat was cold, but my appetite for the impending reality check was ravenous. In the main hall, the polite applause faded back into the low hum of wealthy networking. Then a sharp, dissonant sound sliced through the ambient noise. Gregory Whitmore's personal cell phone began to ring. He ignored it at first, smiling and shaking hands with a state senator. The phone rang again, louder and more insistent. Gregory pulled the device from his jacket pocket, glancing at the screen with an expression of mild annoyance that instantly hardened into absolute panic. He answered the call, pressing the phone tight against his ear as his face drained of all color. The ringing did not stop there. Across the grand dining room, the cell phones of Gregory's primary investors, shadow lenders, and corporate attorneys began vibrating and chiming in a chaotic, synchronized chorus of disaster. Gregory dropped his champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the imported hardwood floor, but no one noticed. Everyone was staring toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the front of the estate. The heavy iron security gates had been forced open. A fleet of 6 identical black corporate sedans rolled aggressively into the circular driveway, their high beams cutting through the darkness and illuminating the manicured lawn. The final collection had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They were thrust apart with a synchronized violent force that rattled the solid brass hinges and sent a shockwave through the room. The polite, low-pitched murmur of high society networking and the soft clinking of fine crystal instantly evaporated. A stark, imposing line of uniform-clad figures marched into the center of the lavish space. They were not private security guards or late-arriving guests seeking to make a grand entrance. They were heavily armed federal marshals flanked by county bailiffs wearing dark tactical vests. The sheer physical presence of the tactical team drained the warmth from the room in a matter of seconds. The classical string quartet in the corner faltered completely. The cellist dragged his bow across the thick strings in a harsh, discordant scrape before freezing in absolute terror. The music died abruptly, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in its wake. Waiters carrying silver trays of imported caviar stopped dead in their tracks, backing away toward the silk-lined walls to avoid the imposing line of federal agents. The marshals moved with absolute practiced efficiency. They did not shout or draw their weapons, but their intent was unmistakably hostile. They formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the main banquet table, effectively isolating Gregory Whitmore from his circle of elite sycophants. Gregory stood at the head of the table, his champagne flute hovering just inches from his lips. The aggressive, flushed color that usually painted his cheeks vanished. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine. The lead marshal, a towering man with a severe, weathered face, stepped directly into Gregory's personal space. He did not offer a polite greeting or wait for an introduction. He reached into his dark tactical jacket and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents securely bound in a heavy manila folder. The brutal reality of the situation crashed into the ballroom. The lead marshal thrust the heavy manila folder directly against Gregory Whitmore's chest, forcing the real estate mogul to either take the documents or let them fall to the polished marble floor. Gregory grabbed the folder automatically, his hands trembling so violently that the thick paper audibly rattled. The marshal spoke in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, projecting his words across the dead-silent ballroom so every prominent guest could hear. He announced that he was executing a federal writ of attachment and a total immediate asset seizure. Every corporate account, every shadow loan, every piece of leveraged commercial real estate tied to the Whitmore name was officially frozen and subject to immediate non-negotiable liquidation. Gregory was legally and practically bankrupt. The wealthy guests gasped physically, stepping further back, treating Gregory as if he had suddenly contracted a lethal, highly contagious disease. Gregory tore open the folder, his eyes scanning the dense legal text in a frantic, desperate search for a bureaucratic error. He flipped rapidly to the final page, searching for the names of the fragmented, disparate creditors he thought he had successfully manipulated. Instead, he found a single consolidated line of text stamped at the bottom. The document clearly stated that the sole primary creditor, the entity holding absolute legal authority over every single piece of his toxic debt, was the Jenkins Family Trust. Gregory stared at the printed name. His lips moved silently, forming the syllables, but his brain completely short-circuited under the massive cognitive dissonance. He had spent months constructing an elaborate, glittering illusion of untouchable wealth, entirely unaware that the man he had ruthlessly mocked was quietly buying the very foundation of his empire. The Jenkins Family Trust did not just hold a minor mortgage. It held the absolute right to dismantle the Whitmore legacy down to the last copper cent. The vast, tangled web of Gregory's black market debts and over-leveraged corporate bonds had been swallowed whole. Gregory slowly raised his head from the damning legal documents. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked intervals as his airway constricted. The realization struck him with the devastating, undeniable force of a physical blow. He slowly turned his neck, scanning the sea of shocked faces until his gaze finally landed on the narrow, dimly lit hallway adjacent to the catering kitchen. He looked past the swinging metal doors, past the frightened, huddled waiters, and locked eyes directly with me. I was sitting at the cheap plastic folding table his daughter had maliciously assigned to us, entirely separated from the affluent crowd. I did not avert my gaze. I did not gloat, cheer, or offer a theatrical grin. I maintained the cold, absolute stillness of a man who had just finalized a lethal corporate execution. Evelyn sat perfectly still beside me, her posture immaculate, watching the architect of her intended ruin crumble in real time. I picked up the crisp white linen napkin resting beside my half-eaten cold steak. I slowly and deliberately wiped the corners of my mouth, folding the cloth and placing it neatly on the plastic tabletop. I pushed my chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly against the linoleum floor, drawing the rapt attention of every single guest in the grand ballroom. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored jacket, and stepped out of the shadows of the scullery. I walked slowly into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers, crossing the polished marble floor until I stood mere feet from the federal marshals. The entire room held its collective breath, watching the grease-stained mechanic command the space. I looked directly at Gregory Whitmore, then shifted my gaze to take in the lavish decorations, the terrified politicians, and my trembling son. I spoke clearly, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with surgical precision. Apologies for the interruption. This property is currently listed in my portfolio of seized assets. The absolute truth of the statement hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I had not just defeated him, I had completely erased him. A piercing, visceral scream shattered the stunned silence of the grand ballroom. Megan Whitmore stood frozen near the head of the banquet table, her hands clutching the sides of her head, her manicured nails digging deep into her perfectly styled hair. Her flawless high society facade disintegrated in an instant. She looked wildly from the federal marshals to the foreclosure documents trembling in her father's hands, and finally to me standing victorious in the absolute center of her newly acquired mansion. The absolute horror of her new reality settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The limitless wealth she firmly believed she had secured for her future was a complete, devastating mirage. She spun around to face Kendall. My son stood paralyzed, his jaw slack, staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and total unadulterated terror. He finally understood the true magnitude of the blue-collar facade I had maintained for 40 years. Megan lunged forward, her eyes blazing with the feral, unrestrained fury. She raised her hand and violently slapped Kendall across the face. The sharp crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling, stinging the ears of the silent crowd. She screamed that he was an absolute idiot, a pathetic, gullible fool who had willingly handed over the keys to a legitimate, sprawling logistics empire for a hollow, bankrupt illusion. She realized with sickening clarity that she had married a man who had just deliberately thrown away a massive multi-million-dollar fortune, simply because he was too arrogant to see the truth standing right in front of him. The federal marshals moved into the grand ballroom with absolute tactical precision, blocking the exits and unfurling asset seizure warrants. The polished facade of the high society gathering shattered instantly into total chaos. Guests dropped their crystal glasses and scrambled away from the tables, their collective panic rising in hushed whispers as they fled toward the courtyard to avoid being entangled in a federal asset liquidation. Gregory Whitmore's elite investors slipped out the side doors, text messaging their legal teams to sever ties before the corporate collapse swallowed their own funds. Megan Whitmore stood entirely frozen in the center of the ballroom, her breathing ragged as she watched the armed bailiffs begin to tag the expensive modern artwork and the platinum bar cart for state inventory. The automated process went forward without error, matching the strict strategic protocols previously structured within the confidential files of Kichbon Ongdaden 2_16.docx. The realization that her entire lifestyle was an illusion turned her eyes cold with fury. She slowly looked at Kendall, who was trembling, his velvet jacket looking suddenly cheap against the backdrop of federal authority. Megan turned on him like a cornered predator, her voice raised to a piercing shriek that pierced the acoustics of the vaulted room. She screamed that she would not let his monumental stupidity drag her family name into a federal penitentiary. She gripped her massive diamond wedding ring, twisting it violently off her finger until her skin was raw, and hurled it directly at Kendall's chest. The platinum band struck his lapel and clattered hollowly onto the marble floor, bouncing away into a puddle of spilled champagne. Megan yelled that her attorney would be filing for an immediate absolute divorce by sunrise, explicitly citing financial fraud and deception to insulate her personal inheritance from his bankruptcy. She turned her back on him, marching toward the vehicles without offering her husband a single backward glance, completing the total fracture of their short-lived alliance. Kendall gasped for air as the gravity of his total ruin pressed down upon his shoulders. His legs gave out completely, and he dropped heavily to his knees onto the slick, wet marble floor of the grand hall. The arrogant posture he had displayed at the microphone evaporated entirely, replaced by the pathetic, weeping demeanor of a child who had finally run out of options. He dragged his knees through the spilled wine and shattered glass, crawling desperately toward the edge of the dining room where Howard stood surrounded by federal marshals. Kendall reached out his hands, his fingers trembling as he tried to grasp the hem of his father's trousers. He wept openly, his voice cracking with a frantic, unvarnished terror that echoed off the high walls. He begged Howard to execute an immediate countermove to lift the crushing foreclosure on the Whitmore assets. He pleaded with his father to use the massive, hidden capital of the logistics empire to satisfy Gregory's creditors and save his fractured marriage from total destruction. His desperate behavior perfectly matched the psychological breakdowns detailed across the analytical profiles in Kichbon Ongdaden 1_16.docx. Kendall whimpered that he had been manipulated by Gregory, claiming he never would have signed those fraudulent guarantees if he had known the true magnitude of his father's hidden wealth. He begged for mercy, asking Howard to show compassion for the sake of the family name, promising he would return every single dollar stolen from Evelyn's heart surgery fund with interest. He knelt in the center of the ruined ballroom, completely stripped of his high society illusions, completely exposed as a parasitic mark who had traded his parents' lifelong sacrifices for a seat at a table that never belonged to him. Evelyn stood beside Howard, her face an unreadable mask of absolute finality, as she looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. There was no explosive anger in her eyes, no desire to scream back at the child she had protected and nurtured through decades of silent blue-collar labor. There was only a cold, profound disappointment that cut deeper than any verbal reprimand ever could. She listened to his desperate promises of repayment and his empty apologies, recognizing that his remorse was born strictly from the loss of his material luxury, not from a genuine awareness of the harm he had inflicted upon his own mother. Evelyn slowly shook her head, her gaze steady and unbroken as she watched Kendall grow hoarse from begging. She completely withdrew her maternal sympathy, stepping away from his outstretched, trembling hands. She leaned over and firmly took Howard's arm, anchoring herself to the partner who had spent 40 years building a legacy of genuine respect and protection for their household. She turned her eyes toward the massive double exit, silently signaling that their business in the mansion was entirely finished. Howard did not offer Kendall a single word of comfort or a backward glance. They walked together across the wet marble lobby, their steady, synchronized footsteps drowning out the sound of their son's frantic sobbing. They left him entirely alone on the cold floor, surrounded by armed federal agents who were already systematically cataloging the assets of his collapsed empire. They pushed through the heavy doors, stepping out of the palace of fraud and back into the clean reality of their own terms, completely severing the final emotional tie to his entitlement. Outside the grand estate, the torrential rain continued to slash through the dark night, turning the gravel driveway into a slick slurry of mud and stone. Gregory Whitmore managed to slip past the initial wave of bailiffs, ducking behind the row of manicured hedges near the perimeter of the courtyard. His expensive wool coat was completely soaked, clinging to his frame as he pulled a secondary untraceable burner phone from his secure pocket. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but he dialed a familiar low-level contact with rapid, frantic movements. The ringing tone cleared, and Gregory spoke into the receiver. His voice reduced to a low, desperate whisper that was nearly swallowed by the roaring wind. He commanded his operative to execute a catastrophic terminal strike immediately. He ordered the man to burn the repair shop to the ground tonight before morning light could expose the underlying fraud. Gregory growled that every square inch of the cinderblock building must be entirely reduced to ash, specifically demanding the total destruction of the secure file cabinets housed inside the main office. He knew that if the forensic investigators analyzed the physical paper trail stored within those walls, they would uncover the exact architecture of his forged property deeds and the systemic embezzlement schemes that connected his firm to the lenders. He commanded the caller to erase the evidence completely, promising a massive cash payout once the insurance claim was finalized, setting into motion a desperate, violent cover-up to destroy the truth before the noose tightened completely. The wail of emergency sirens pierced the cold midnight air, a mechanical scream that tore through the quiet industrial district. I stood on the cracked concrete of the opposite sidewalk, the intense heat of the inferno baking the moisture off my face. The repair shop, the unassuming cinderblock fortress I had meticulously maintained for 4 continuous decades, was entirely engulfed in a raging wall of orange and crimson flames. Thick black smoke billowed into the dark sky, completely blotting out the stars and choking the street with the bitter scent of burning rubber and scorched metal. I watched the heavy, rolling bay doors warp and buckle under the catastrophic thermal pressure. The glass from the small front office windows shattered outward in a violent shower of jagged sparks, spraying across the flooded parking lot. Fire trucks surrounded the perimeter, their flashing red and white lights reflecting off the wet pavement. High-pressure hoses blasted thousands of gallons of water into the core of the blaze, but the fire fought back with an unnatural, hungry ferocity. This building was the original cornerstone of my entire logistics empire. It was the physical space where I had stripped engines, negotiated my first freight contracts, and built the phantom wealth that now controlled the destiny of the men who despised me. I did not shed a single tear as the roof finally collapsed inward with a deafening structural groan. Gregory Whitmore intended this destruction to be a devastating psychological blow. He wanted to watch my legacy turn to ash. He fundamentally misunderstood the man he was fighting. The shop was just a building. My empire existed in the shadows, entirely untouchable by fire. A heavy figure in thick turnout gear approached me through the thick haze of smoke and flashing lights. Chief Miller pulled off his soot-stained helmet, wiping a dark layer of grime from his forehead with the back of his heavy glove. He had known me for 20 years, occasionally bringing his personal vehicles to my bay for transmission work. He did not offer empty condolences or sympathetic platitudes. He spoke with the grim clinical precision of a veteran arson investigator. He informed me that the initial burn patterns were highly irregular. The fire had not started from a faulty wire or a stray spark in the oil pit. Chief Miller stated definitively that a massive volume of industrial chemical accelerant had been deliberately poured across the primary load-bearing walls and directly into the central administrative office. It was a calculated professional arson designed for maximum structural annihilation. Gregory Whitmore had clearly ordered a surgical strike. He genuinely believed that my operational center was a relic of the past, fully reliant on the ancient metal filing cabinets housed in that front room. He expected the intricate paper trail of his forged property deeds, the shadow loans, and the commercial transfer documents to burn into untraceable carbon. He needed the physical evidence of his vast financial fraud completely eradicated before the authorities could officially audit his bankrupt firm. Gregory thought he was erasing the noose from around his neck. He thought he could sanitize his crimes by turning my history into a blazing crime scene. He assumed the destruction of my filing cabinets equated to the destruction of my legal leverage. He was operating on an antiquated, desperate assumption. I thanked Chief Miller for his swift assessment, turned away from the smoldering wreckage, and walked back to my truck. I drove through the empty, rain-slicked streets of the city, my mind operating with total clinical detachment. I arrived at my primary residence, bypassing the main living areas entirely, and descended directly into the subterranean level of the house. Evelyn was asleep upstairs, completely insulated from the escalating violence of the night. I approached a reinforced steel blast door seamlessly integrated into the concrete foundation. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner and entered a complex, rotating 12-digit passcode. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a solid metallic clank. I stepped into my primary off-site server room, a climate-controlled bunker, humming with rows of high-capacity digital storage arrays. When I built the logistics empire, I digitized every single scrap of corporate data, mirroring the entire network across multiple redundant servers. The metal filing cabinets at the repair shop contained absolutely nothing but blank paper and obsolete tax forms from a decade ago. I sat down at the central terminal and accessed the encrypted security feeds from the commercial lot. I had personally installed 12 high-definition heat-shielded micro cameras throughout the shop's architecture, completely invisible to the naked eye. I pulled up the midnight timeline and watched the crystal-clear footage populate the primary monitor. The digital recording showed a man prying open the rear service door with a crowbar. He moved through the dark garage, systematically dousing the walls with heavy metal canisters of gasoline. The camera mounted directly above the main office doorway captured him turning to ignite a flare. The high-definition lens locked onto his face with absolute, undeniable clarity. It was not a random street criminal. It was Gregory Whitmore's personal chauffeur, a man I had seen opening the door of the Bentley just hours prior. I sat in the cold glow of the monitors, isolating the exact frame where the driver's face was fully illuminated by the violent ignition of the flare. I extracted the raw, unedited video files, transferring the catastrophic evidence onto a secure, encrypted drive. Gregory had dispatched a direct employee of his own household to commit a major felony, binding his personal circle to the arson with an unbreakable chain of evidence. I completely bypassed the local municipal police department. Local detectives were vulnerable to Gregory's lingering political connections and high-priced legal delays. I did not want this investigation buried in a pile of regional bureaucracy. I picked up my secure phone and initiated a direct line to a senior federal prosecutor I had retained during the expansion of my interstate trucking routes. I informed him that I possessed undeniable high-definition evidence of a targeted arson attack on a commercial facility. I explicitly clarified that the fire was commissioned specifically to destroy corporate financial records related to an ongoing multi-million-dollar federal bankruptcy and asset seizure. The prosecutor's tone immediately sharpened, recognizing the immense gravity of the situation. Deliberate arson is a severe state crime, but committing arson with the explicit intent to destroy federal financial records elevates the act to a massive federal felony carrying decades of mandatory prison time. Gregory had not merely burned down a garage. He had brazenly attacked the integrity of a federal financial investigation. I secured the encrypted drive in my briefcase, prepared to hand-deliver the final nail for Gregory Whitmore's coffin at first light. The tactical escalation was complete. The sun broke over the city skyline as federal tactical units descended upon the towering glass facade of Whitmore Enterprises. Dozens of FBI agents in dark windbreakers moved with synchronized lethal efficiency through the revolving doors of the corporate headquarters. They bypassed the panicked receptionists and swarmed the executive elevators locking down the building. On the top floor, Gregory Whitmore was desperately attempting to reassure his panicked board of directors. He stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, weaving a frantic narrative about minor liquidity issues and a tragic but convenient fire at a contested property. His lies were abruptly severed when the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom were thrown open. Armed agents flooded the space, their presence instantly suffocating the arrogant atmosphere of the room. The lead federal agent did not offer Gregory the courtesy of a private conversation. He loudly announced the federal charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and directing a felony arson to destroy financial records under federal subpoena. Gregory's face drained of all color, his polished facade shattering completely in front of the very people he had spent years manipulating. He stammered, demanding to call his attorneys, but his protests fell on deaf ears. An agent grabbed his wrists, twisting them painfully behind his back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around them. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent boardroom. The directors watched in absolute horror as the architect of their wealth was physically stripped of his power. Gregory was marched out of the executive suite, dragged past his horrified staff, and paraded through the main lobby in total disgrace. News helicopters hovered above the plaza, broadcasting the ultimate humiliation of the untouchable tycoon live across the state. He was shoved roughly into the back of a waiting federal cruiser, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the faces of the gathering press outside. The empire he had built on fraud and intimidation was officially dismantled, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of a federal penitentiary. Less than 2 hours after the news of the spectacular corporate raid saturated the local broadcasts, heavy footsteps pounded furiously against the wooden planks of my front porch. A frantic, desperate hammering rattled my front door, accompanied by muffled, hysterical sobbing. I walked calmly from the kitchen and pulled open the heavy interior door, leaving the reinforced steel mesh screen securely locked in place. Megan Whitmore stood on my welcome mat, entirely unrecognizable from the glamorous, haughty woman who had sneered at me in her multi-million-dollar mansion just days prior. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her makeup smeared across her tear-streaked face in dark, chaotic tracks. The woman who had once shoved me backward into the mud with absolute disgust was now shivering in the afternoon breeze, completely broken. She gripped the metal mesh of the screen door, her knuckles turning white as she wept openly. Megan begged me to contact the federal prosecutors and withdraw the arson and fraud evidence. She pleaded for mercy, sobbing that her father was an old man who would not survive a lengthy sentence in a federal prison. She promised to sign over any remaining personal assets, offering hollow, frantic apologies for her past cruelty, completely abandoning her high society pride in a desperate bid to save her family from total annihilation. She looked at the blue-collar mechanic she had treated as subhuman and begged him to act as her savior. She expected my compassion to override my demand for justice, clinging to the delusion that her tears could wash away the profound damage her family had inflicted upon mine. She babbled incoherently about second chances, unable to accept that the game was permanently over. I stood completely motionless in the foyer, observing her frantic display of grief through the wire mesh. I felt no satisfaction or joy in her suffering, but I also felt an absolute absence of pity. My compassion had been exhausted the moment her father ordered a physical attack on my legacy and attempted to frame my son into a massive financial conspiracy. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and spoke with a cold, unwavering finality. I told her that the federal government was now in complete control of the investigation, and I absolutely refused to negotiate with criminals. I reminded her that her family had built their lavish lifestyle by destroying honest people, and they were simply facing the inevitable, devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. She opened her mouth to scream another desperate plea, raising her trembling hand to claw at the wire screen in a pathetic display of entitlement. I did not give her the opportunity to utter another manipulative word. I stepped back, gripped the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door, and swung it shut with decisive, uncompromising force. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly into place, instantly cutting off her hysterical sobbing and sealing the boundary between her manufactured chaos and my hard-won peace. I walked away from the entrance, moving back toward the quiet warmth of the kitchen, leaving her to collapse on the cold wooden planks of the porch, completely isolated in the ashes of her ruin. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, the quiet sanctuary of my home completely restored. The silence was briefly interrupted by the sharp ringing of my secure cell phone. It was Jonathan Hayes, my lead attorney, calling from his office in the financial district. His voice lacked its usual measured professional cadence, replaced by a tone of urgent disbelief. He had just received a chaotic update from the asset liquidation team actively dismantling the Whitmore estate. Jonathan informed me that Kendall had completely vanished. Amidst the chaos of Gregory's federal arrest and Megan's frantic departure to my house, my son had seen an extremely narrow window of opportunity and seized it with ruthless efficiency. Before fleeing the sprawling mansion, Kendall had bypassed the estate's security protocols and cracked Megan's private biometric wall safe. He completely emptied it of every untraceable asset she possessed, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency cash reserves, bearer bonds, and a massive collection of uninsured diamond jewelry. He did not leave a note, a forwarding address, or a single trace of his intended destination. He had recognized the absolute collapse of his unearned lifestyle and chose to abandon his furious wife to face the federal fallout entirely alone. Kendall had taken the final desperate lesson of the Whitmores to heart, transforming into a pure predator to ensure his own survival. Jonathan asked me for instructions on how the private investigators should proceed. I looked out the kitchen window, digesting the sheer magnitude of my son's final betrayal. The trap had effectively crushed Gregory, but it had pushed Kendall into the darkest, most dangerous territory of all. I instructed Jonathan to deploy our tracking teams immediately, knowing my son was now a desperate fugitive carrying stolen wealth, rapidly running out of places to hide. Megan Whitmore did not mourn the sudden, spectacular death of her marriage. She immediately weaponized her rage. She marched into the municipal police precinct before the sun even crested the horizon, shivering in the cold morning air. Her designer silver gown was stained and ruined from the chaotic flight from the mansion, but her posture was rigid with absolute calculated malice. She bypassed the desk sergeant and demanded to speak directly to the lead detective of the Financial Crimes Unit. Megan slammed a leather-bound ledger of her emptied private safe onto the scratched steel desk, detailing the exact inventory of the stolen emergency cash, the bearer bonds, and the uninsured diamonds. She formally pressed charges against Kendall for grand larceny, officially documenting the theft of her personal inheritance. She did not stop there. To completely insulate herself from the impending federal fallout of her father's collapsed empire, she officially turned state's evidence against her own husband. She handed the detectives the original physical copies of the fraudulent corporate guarantees Kendall had signed. She explicitly stated he had committed identity theft by forging my signature to secure the shadow loans, conveniently omitting her family's direct involvement in the scheme. She painted Kendall as the sole architect of the entire financial catastrophe, framing herself as the innocent, manipulated victim of his deceit. Her betrayal was clinical, ruthless, and absolute. She severed the final legal ties to Kendall, ensuring that when the authorities finally caught him, he would face decades in a federal penitentiary, while she walked away with her freedom completely intact. The rapid escalation of the legal situation reached me through a secure briefing from Jonathan Hayes. He called my private line just before noon, his voice sharp and strictly professional. The local precinct had immediately forwarded Megan's grand larceny and identity theft charges to the federal authorities currently dismantling Gregory's estate. Because Kendall had crossed state lines with stolen, untraceable assets and was intimately tied to a multi-million-dollar federal fraud investigation, the situation had instantly escalated beyond municipal jurisdiction. Jonathan informed me that the FBI had officially issued a federal arrest warrant for Kendall. An active, high-priority interstate manhunt was currently underway. Federal marshals had frozen his credit cards, flagged his passport, and distributed his photograph to every major transit hub, airport, and border crossing in the region. He was entirely cut off from the banking system, forced to survive purely on the stolen cash and diamonds he carried in his duffel bag. Jonathan laid out the stark, brutal reality of the chase. Kendall had zero experience operating as a fugitive. He lacked the specialized underworld contacts required to launder the stolen jewelry or secure safe passage out of the country without triggering a federal alert. He was a sheltered amateur running blind through a landscape entirely controlled by highly trained federal predators. State troopers were actively establishing roadblocks along the major highways extending from the financial district. The authorities anticipated capturing him within 48 hours. The net was closing rapidly across the entire state, and my son was completely trapped inside it with nowhere left to run. I spent the evening sitting alone in the quiet isolation of my home study. The room was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows against the oak-paneled walls. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the past month settled heavily into my bones, but my mind remained agonizingly sharp. I looked at a framed photograph resting on the edge of the bookshelf. It captured Kendall at 10 years old, his face covered in engine grease, smiling proudly as he handed me a heavy wrench in the old repair shop. That innocent boy had been completely consumed by greed and entitlement. The hardest decision a father must ever make is the conscious choice to stand down while the world crushes his own flesh and blood. Every parental instinct I possessed screamed at me to deploy my vast logistics network to find him before the federal agents did. I had the capital, the untraceable vehicles, and the resources to sweep him away to a non-extradition country, to shield him from the brutal consequences of his actions. I stared at the photograph and firmly crushed that instinct. Protecting Kendall now would only validate his destructive arrogance. It would teach him that his actions carried zero consequences, forever cementing his toxic worldview. He had chosen to ally himself with criminals, and he had chosen to steal from his own wife to save his skin. I resolved to maintain my absolute boundary. I would not intervene. I would let the federal justice system process him entirely. It was the only way he would ever learn the true cost of his betrayal. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning. I remained awake in the study, staring blankly at the financial ledgers detailing the complete absorption of the Whitmore assets. The profound silence of the house was suddenly broken by a dull, heavy thud echoing from the backyard. The impact vibrated faintly through the floorboards, completely out of rhythm with the ambient noise of the neighborhood. I stood up, immediately moving with silent precision. I bypassed the main hallway and walked quietly into the darkened kitchen. The security lights mounted above the back patio remained off, leaving the yard shrouded in total darkness. I stood near the marble island, watching the heavy glass of the sliding patio doors. A sudden wet slap struck the reinforced glass pane. I stepped closer, my eyes adjusting to the ambient moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. A hand smeared with dark, thick blood pressed flat against the outside of the glass. The bloody fingers slipped downward, leaving a long, crimson streak across the clean surface as the person collapsed against the frame. I reached out and unlocked the deadbolt, sliding the heavy glass door open. Kendall fell forward onto the kitchen floor. His expensive clothes were shredded and soaked in mud. His face was heavily bruised, and blood poured freely from a deep laceration on his shoulder. He gasped for air, clutching a torn, empty canvas duffel bag to his chest. The fugitive had dragged himself back to the only sanctuary he had left. I grabbed Kendall by the collar of his shredded, mud-soaked designer jacket and hauled his dead weight over the threshold. He collapsed onto the pristine kitchen tile, leaving a thick smear of dark blood across the floorboards. The heavy glass of the patio door clicked shut behind us, instantly sealing out the howling wind and the torrential rain. I knelt beside my son, assessing the sheer brutality of his injuries under the harsh, fluorescent overhead lights. His left eye was swollen completely shut, surrounded by an ugly, dark purple contusion that stretched down to his fractured cheekbone. A deep, jagged laceration ran along his shoulder, soaking his ripped shirt in fresh crimson. He was shivering violently, clutching the empty canvas duffel bag to his chest, as if it still held the stolen fortune he had stripped from Megan's wall safe. He had not lost the money to the federal marshals tracking him across the state lines. The shadow lenders Gregory Whitmore had relied upon operated entirely outside the bounds of federal jurisdiction, and they had clearly mobilized faster than the authorities. The black market financiers did not care about corporate foreclosure or bankruptcy courts. They cared strictly about liquidating assets to cover their massive losses, and they had efficiently tracked Kendall down before he could cross the county line. The violent collection agents had intercepted him, brutally beaten him within an inch of his life, and stripped him of every stolen diamond and dollar bill he carried. He had fled his crumbling mansion, believing he could outsmart the criminal underworld with a bag of stolen jewelry. Instead, he had walked directly into a brutal, unforgiving reality. He lay on my kitchen floor, completely stripped of his arrogance, reduced to a shivering, broken fugitive. Kendall rolled onto his side, coughing violently. He spat a thick wad of blood onto the polished tile, groaning as the movement aggravated his fractured ribs. Evelyn rushed down the stairs, her robe pulled tight around her shoulders, stopping dead at the horrifying sight of her battered son. Kendall looked up at her, his remaining functional eye widening with frantic feral desperation. He dragged himself across the floor toward her feet, leaving a gruesome trail behind him. He reached up with shaking bloody fingers and grasped the hem of her robe. He wept uncontrollably, screaming that the men who attacked him were going to come back and finish the job. He babbled that they had taken everything, but it was not enough to cover the massive debt Gregory had accumulated. He turned his desperate gaze toward me, demanding access to my hidden capital. He begged me to immediately hand over $50,000 in unmarked cash and the keys to my untraceable truck. He outlined a frantic, unhinged plan to drive south, slip across the border, and vanish into a country lacking an extradition treaty. He insisted that with enough liquid cash, he could bribe his way past the checkpoint and start a new life. When I remained completely silent, Kendall escalated his panic. He shifted his focus entirely back to Evelyn, weaponizing his vulnerability to exploit her maternal instinct. He cried out for his mother, sobbing that he was still her little boy. He begged her to save his life, claiming he would surely be murdered before dawn if we did not fund his escape. He tried to physically pull himself up by clinging to her legs, demanding she force me to open the safe. He used the exact same manipulative whining tone he had employed as a teenager whenever he needed to avoid the consequences of his reckless behavior. He expected Evelyn to break down to override my authority and to shelter him from the violent storm he had actively invited into his life. He demanded salvation without offering a single ounce of genuine remorse. Evelyn looked down at the weeping, bloodied man clinging to her robe. Her face remained a mask of profound, enduring sorrow, but she did not shed a tear. She gently but firmly peeled his bloody fingers away from the fabric of her clothing and took a deliberate step back. She turned without a word, walking into the adjacent utility room, and returned carrying a heavy industrial first aid kit. She knelt beside him on the cold tile, opened the plastic case, and pulled out a stack of sterile gauze pads and a bottle of antiseptic. She began to clean the deep laceration on his shoulder with absolute mechanical precision. She applied pressure to the bleeding wounds, working with the quiet, efficient stoicism of a woman tending to a stranger. She did not offer him any false comfort, nor did she acknowledge his frantic demands for cash and vehicles. Her silence was absolute. I stepped away from the grisly scene on the floor and walked over to the kitchen counter. I picked up the heavy receiver of the landline phone mounted on the wall. I did not hesitate or debate the morality of my next action. I pressed 3 digits into the keypad, the sharp electronic tones ringing out clearly over the sound of Kendall's panicked sobbing. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately. I stated my exact address and reported a severely injured fugitive on the premises, requesting an immediate police and medical dispatch. Kendall froze, the color draining entirely from his battered face as he processed the reality of the phone call. The sheer disbelief morphed instantly into a raw, venomous hatred. He thrashed against Evelyn's hands, pushing the sterile gauze away, and screamed at the top of his lungs. He called me a cold-blooded monster, a ruthless, vindictive tyrant who was willingly sending his own flesh and blood to the slaughter. He shrieked that the federal authorities would lock him away for decades, utterly destroying his life for a single financial mistake. He cursed the day he was born into my household, spitting venomous insults and accusing me of enjoying his absolute destruction. I hung up the receiver and looked down at him. My expression remained entirely neutral, reflecting the cold, hard logic of a man who understood the brutal mechanics of survival. I told him clearly that the shadow lenders who had intercepted him tonight did not negotiate, and they did not operate within the bounds of a courtroom. They were ruthless executioners who would hunt him down and kill him the moment he stepped outside our door. I stated with absolute, unwavering certainty that a federal prison cell was the only remaining place on Earth where the loan sharks could not reach him. I was not destroying his life. I was effectively saving it by removing him from the hunting grounds. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by his ragged, defeated breathing. Then the shrill wail of approaching sirens pierced the stormy night. Bright, flashing red and blue lights swept across the rain-slicked driveway, illuminating the kitchen through the blood-stained patio glass. The authorities had arrived to collect their fugitive. The flashing lights illuminating my driveway marked the definitive end of the physical confrontation, shifting the battlefield directly into the sterile, unforgiving environment of the federal courthouse. Months of meticulous legal maneuvering culminated in a packed courtroom, the gallery overflowing with financial reporters, defrauded investors, and former high society sycophants eager to witness a spectacular downfall. I sat in the front row beside Evelyn, our posture relaxed, observing the stark reality unfolding beyond the wooden railing. Gregory Whitmore and his daughter Megan sat at the defense table entirely stripped of the golden armor they once wielded so effortlessly. Gregory wore a standard-issue, ill-fitting suit provided by his public defender, his previously immaculate hair now thinning and stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked small, a hollowed-out shell of a man whose entire identity had been completely dependent on stolen capital. Megan sat rigidly beside him, completely drained of her haughty arrogance. The glittering diamonds and silk evening gowns had been replaced by a drab, muted blouse. Her posture screamed of exhaustion and absolute defeat. The fake empire they had violently protected was completely dismantled, liquidated down to the last copper cent to satisfy the federal mandates. They were no longer untouchable titans of industry. They were simply two desperate individuals facing the crushing weight of a federal indictment exposed to the world without a single financial shield left to hide behind. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room swung open as the bailiff called the court to order, signaling the absolute conclusion of their reign. The federal prosecutor called my name, and I walked to the witness stand with steady, measured steps. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down facing the jury. I did not speak with anger, and I did not allow a single ounce of vindictive triumph to bleed into my voice. I projected the cold, calculating precision of a man simply laying out an undeniable sequence of facts. Under the prosecutor's guidance, I detailed the exact timeline of the Whitmore conspiracy. I explained how Kendall had manipulated his mother's illness to drain her surgery fund, paving the way for Gregory to illegally seize our property. I presented the forensic evidence regarding the forged medical records Gregory had secretly commissioned, an insidious parallel scheme designed to declare me mentally incompetent and seize my logistical assets through a shadow conservatorship before I could expose his bankruptcy. I laid out the financial theft, tracing the exact routing numbers where Gregory had funneled my family's money to prop up his failing mortgages. Finally, I addressed the midnight fire. I calmly described watching my shop burn, presenting the unedited high-definition security footage of Gregory's personal driver dousing the administrative office in industrial accelerant. I detailed how the arson was a desperate, calculated strike ordered by Gregory himself to incinerate the paper trail of his massive fraud. The defense attorney attempted to cross-examine me, trying to paint me as a vindictive, estranged father executing a personal vendetta. I systematically dismantled his narrative without raising my voice. I answered every aggressive question with objective dates, bank routing numbers, and irrefutable video timestamps. My absolute composure highlighted the frantic, sloppy nature of the defense. The jury watched Gregory physically shrink into his chair as his entire strategy evaporated. My calm, factual testimony did not just defeat their legal narrative. It completely obliterated any remaining shred of reasonable doubt in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a unanimous, damning verdict on all counts. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar predators, ordered Gregory and Megan to stand for sentencing. She looked down from the bench, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom as she condemned their actions as a breathtaking display of systemic greed and moral bankruptcy. She addressed Gregory, directly dismantling his legacy in front of the entire gallery before delivering the final blow. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, sentencing Gregory Whitmore to 15 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary, completely denying any possibility of early parole. Gregory collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands as the reality of dying behind bars finally crushed him. The judge then turned her absolute authority toward Megan. She noted Megan's active complicity in hiding stolen assets and leveraging fraudulent capital. The gavel fell a second time. The judge officially declared Megan legally bankrupt, stripping her of every hidden offshore account, luxury vehicle, and secondary property she had desperately tried to conceal. Furthermore, the court ordered her to pay massive lifelong civil restitution to the Jenkins Family Trust and the countless other creditors she had helped defraud. Megan stared blankly ahead, entirely paralyzed by the verdict. She would spend the rest of her natural life working a minimum wage job, her wages aggressively garnished until every stolen cent was repaid. The bailiff stepped forward, securely handcuffing Gregory and leading him away from the defense table. The Whitmore dynasty was permanently erased. Kendall was not permitted to stand trial alongside the Whitmores. His actions, while deeply intertwined with Gregory's fraud, required a separate judicial hearing due to his frantic, violent flight from the law. 2 weeks after Gregory's sentencing, Evelyn and I returned to a smaller, strictly secured courtroom. Kendall was brought out from the holding cells through a side door. He wore a faded orange county jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy steel transport chains. The swelling on his face had subsided, but the deep, jagged scar on his shoulder remained visible beneath his collar. He looked entirely defeated, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire adult life. The judge acknowledged his minor cooperation regarding the loan sharks, but firmly condemned his profound betrayal of his own family and his willing participation in massive financial theft. The gavel struck the block, sentencing Kendall to 3 mandatory years in a minimum security federal correctional facility for wire fraud and grand larceny. He did not cry or protest the ruling. He simply bowed his head, accepting the absolute consequence of his choices. As the federal marshals gripped his arms to lead him back toward the transport vehicles, Kendall stopped walking. He turned his head and looked across the wooden divider, locking eyes directly with me. There was no defiance left in his gaze, only a quiet, painful understanding of the boundary I had drawn. He finally recognized that true love requires absolute accountability. I stood up from the gallery bench, my posture straight and unyielding. I looked at the son I had raised, the man who had traded our legacy for a mirage, and I nodded slowly. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind him, sealing his fate and allowing our family to finally begin the long, quiet work of healing. The morning air carried a sharp, bitter chill as Evelyn and I stood on the cracked concrete perimeter of the commercial lot. The sprawling cinderblock fortress that had served as the physical anchor of my logistics empire for 4 decades was entirely gone. In its place, a fleet of heavy yellow bulldozers and front-end loaders systematically scraped the earth. Their massive steel blades gouged deep into the blackened soil, pushing massive piles of charred debris, twisted metal, and shattered glass into waiting dump trucks. The rhythmic, guttural roar of the diesel engines echoed across the industrial district, a mechanical requiem for the sanctuary I had built with my own hands. I watched a heavy excavator tear into the ruined foundation of the central administrative office. That was the exact spot where Gregory Whitmore's hired arsonist had poured gallons of chemical accelerant, foolishly believing he could incinerate my digital legacy by burning a room full of empty metal filing cabinets. The heavy machinery pulverized the remaining concrete pillars, reducing the warped architecture into fine gray dust. I felt the cold wind tug at my heavy wool coat. For months, this location had been a smoldering crime scene wrapped in bright yellow police tape, crawling with federal arson investigators and municipal inspectors. Now the barricades were gone. The municipal authorities had officially released the property back into my possession following the successful federal convictions. Evelyn stood silently beside me, her presence a steady, grounding force against the chaotic noise of the demolition. We watched the heavy tracks of the bulldozers flatten the earth, erasing the final physical scars of the brutal financial war that had consumed our family. The destruction was absolute, but the devastation felt remarkably like progress. A sleek black sedan pulled onto the freshly cleared edge of the property, its tires crunching softly against the loose gravel. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward us with a confident, measured stride. It was Marcus Vance, a seasoned corporate strategist I had aggressively recruited from a rival logistics conglomerate on the East Coast. For 40 years, I had maintained the deliberate facade of a humble blue-collar mechanic. I had meticulously hidden my massive wealth behind oil-stained coveralls and the grimy bay doors of a local repair shop to protect my family from the corrupting influence of visible money. That absolute secrecy was no longer required. The federal trial had forcefully dragged my phantom empire out of the shadows and directly into the unforgiving light of public record. The entire financial sector now fully understood the immense scale of the corporate apparatus I controlled. Rebuilding a small, unassuming garage on this barren plot of land would be a meaningless regression. The time for hiding was officially over. I turned to Marcus as he approached, pulling a heavy ring of brass keys and a secure encrypted access drive from my coat pocket. I handed them over to him, officially transferring the operational reins of my entire interstate trucking and freight network. Marcus accepted the transfer with a firm handshake and a solemn nod, fully understanding the massive responsibility he was inheriting. He would run the corporate logistics empire from a highly secure glass-paneled high-rise in the financial district, completely insulating me from the daily mechanics of the industry. I was stepping away from the battlefield entirely. The ruthless financial war that Gregory Whitmore had arrogantly ignited was definitively over. I had systematically dismantled his fraudulent dynasty, protected my assets, and secured the absolute safety of my wife. I had no desire to spend the remaining years of my life analyzing freight margins or negotiating corporate acquisitions. I was finally claiming my retirement. Marcus returned to his vehicle, leaving Evelyn and me standing alone on the edge of the flattened, empty lot. The roaring diesel engines of the demolition crew had finally powered down for their midday break, allowing a profound, sweeping silence to settle over the property. Evelyn stepped closer, slipping her arm through mine and resting her gloved hand gently against my sleeve. I looked down at her, seeing the deep, enduring resilience in her eyes. We took a slow, deep breath together. The bitter, acrid stench of scorched rubber and burned ash that had choked this street for months was entirely gone. The wind sweeping off the distant bay carried a crisp, clean scent, cutting through the lingering industrial exhaust. Every toxic element that had poisoned our lives over the past year had been systematically eradicated. The arrogant predators who sought to steal our wealth were securely locked inside federal penitentiaries. The fragile illusions of unearned luxury had been shattered. Even the physical building that had anchored my deceptive double life had been reduced to a perfectly flat expanse of leveled dirt. The absolute destruction had left behind a brilliant, unblemished blank slate. We were no longer bound by the heavy burdens of secrecy or the agonizing exhaustion of defending our home from our own flesh and blood. The slate was wiped clean, offering us the rare, precious opportunity to define our future purely on our own terms. The crunch of tires against the gravel broke the quiet atmosphere as Jonathan Hayes drove his silver coupe onto the lot. My lead attorney parked near the sidewalk and walked briskly toward us, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He did not look like a man preparing for another grueling courtroom battle. He carried the relaxed, definitive posture of a strategist delivering a final victory report. Jonathan greeted Evelyn with a warm smile before turning his professional focus directly to me. He unclasped the portfolio and handed me a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. He confirmed that the municipal bank had officially executed the final foreclosure protocols on Kendall and Megan's sprawling suburban estate. The massive multi-million-dollar mansion purchased entirely with Gregory Whitmore's fraudulent shadow loans had been seized by federal liquidators earlier that morning. Jonathan described how the bank contractors had arrived at dawn, changing the locks on the heavy mahogany doors and placing stark white foreclosure notices across the manicured front lawn. The luxury vehicles, the imported Italian furniture, and the massive collection of modern art had all been auctioned off to partially satisfy the staggering civil restitution Megan was ordered to pay. Everything they had falsely claimed as their own had been brutally reclaimed by reality. The sprawling physical monument to Kendall's extreme arrogance and Megan's toxic greed no longer belonged to them. The bank had erased their fabricated high society identity down to the very last brick. I handed the foreclosure documents back to Jonathan and thanked him for his impeccable service. I turned away from the empty dirt lot, placing my hand firmly on the small of Evelyn's back. We walked slowly toward our car, leaving the ashes of the past behind us. The false reality was entirely extinguished, and we were finally going home. 6 months had passed since the flashing lights of the police cruisers vanished down my driveway, taking my son into the crushing machinery of the federal justice system. The transition from the sprawling manicured lawns of his stolen mansion to the bleak concrete reality of the state correctional facility was absolute. I walked through the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the visitor entrance, the sharp clank of the locking mechanisms echoing with absolute finality. The air inside smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat, a sterile, unforgiving environment designed to strip away every illusion of grandeur. I surrendered my personal belongings to a stern-faced corrections officer, walking through the metal detectors with the same clinical detachment I used to audit freight manifests. The high-security visiting room was a long, cavernous corridor lined with thick, bulletproof plexiglass partitions. Fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the inmates and their fractured families. I took a seat in a bolted metal chair at booth number 4, placing my hands flat on the scratched counter. I had spent the last 40 years building a phantom logistics empire to protect my family from the cold brutality of poverty, but I could not protect my son from the consequences of his own boundless greed. The prison was the ultimate equalizer. It did not care about designer suits, forged commercial deeds, or the political connections of the Whitmore dynasty. It only cared about time, and Kendall had plenty of it to serve. A heavy metal door at the back of the visiting sector groaned open, and a line of inmates shuffled into the room under the watchful eyes of armed guards. I spotted Kendall immediately, though he was entirely stripped of the polished corporate arrogance that had defined his adult life. He wore a faded standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over his shrinking frame. He had lost at least 20 pounds, the rich meals and expensive whiskey replaced by the rigid caloric restrictions of institutional dining. The meticulously styled haircut, paid for with stolen money, was gone, replaced by a harsh, uneven buzz cut that exposed the sharp angles of his skull. The deep laceration on his shoulder had healed into a jagged, permanent scar, a lingering souvenir from the loan sharks he had desperately tried to outsmart. He sat down in the plastic chair opposite me, separated by 2 inches of reinforced acrylic glass. He looked up, and the sheer emptiness in his eyes struck me. The relentless scheming energy, the toxic ambition that had driven him to betray his own mother and ally with a criminal, was entirely extinguished. He was hollowed out, exhausted, down to the marrow of his bones. Kendall reached for the black telephone receiver mounted to the wall, his hand trembling slightly. I picked up the corresponding receiver on my side. We stared at each other through the smudged plexiglass, the physical barrier serving as a perfect manifestation of the boundary I had drawn between us. He did not speak immediately. The suffocating reality of his incarceration hung heavily on the wire. There were no glib excuses, no arrogant justifications, and no blame shifting. The prison had successfully broken the facade. He was finally forced to look at the man who had warned him about the fire he was playing with, sitting across from him in the ashes. Kendall pressed the plastic receiver tightly against his ear, his voice sounding thin and metallic through the wire. He did not ask about Evelyn. He did not ask how I was managing the transition of the business. He defaulted instantly to the only language he had ever truly understood: transactional manipulation. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the guards before fixing back on me. He asked for a deposit of $5,000 into his commissary account, claiming he needed the funds to secure basic protections and decent food on his cell block. He then escalated his demands, begging me to retain a high-priced appellate attorney from the city. He insisted that with the right legal team and a massive retainer, he could appeal his sentence and secure an early parole hearing before the end of the year. He was still searching for a shortcut, still hoping that my phantom wealth could act as a shield against his required punishment. I listened to his frantic pitch without interrupting, my expression entirely neutral. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke with a quiet, uncompromising authority. I refused both requests entirely. I told him that I would not spend a single cent to make his incarceration comfortable, nor would I finance a legal battle to shorten the sentence he rightfully earned. I looked directly into his desperate, sinking eyes and delivered the absolute truth. I told him he would serve his time, and he would earn his release. There were no buyouts in this room, and there were no shadow loans to cover his debts. He was going to sit in that cell and pay the full price for his betrayal. The absolute rejection hit Kendall like a physical blow. His hollow exhaustion morphed instantly into a flare of frustrated, impotent rage. The reality that his father, the man controlling a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, would completely refuse to write a simple check to alleviate his suffering, finally penetrated his thick skull. He gripped the receiver, his knuckles turning white, his face twisting into a bitter scowl. He cursed me, his voice cracking with venom, accusing me of abandoning him to rot in a concrete box while I enjoyed the peace of my newly sanitized life. He slammed the black receiver violently against the metal hook, cutting the connection and severing our conversation. The loud clatter drew the sharp attention of a nearby guard, but I had already made my move. I did not attempt to call him back, nor did I linger to watch his tantrum. I simply stood up from the bolted metal chair, straightened my coat, and turned my back on the plexiglass partition. I walked down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor, listening to the heavy steel doors engage and lock behind me as I moved toward the exit. The lesson I was imparting was agonizingly harsh, a profound burden that only a father could bear. But the boundary was absolutely necessary. Saving him from the pain of accountability had always been my greatest failure, and I refused to repeat that mistake. I stepped out of the facility and into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. The financial war was over, the toxic elements had been burned away, and the final boundary was set in stone. The autumn evening settled over the city, carrying a crisp chill that signaled the changing of the seasons. Evelyn and I were celebrating exactly 40 years of marriage. We did not rent a lavish ballroom, nor did we invite hundreds of peripheral acquaintances to a catered, ostentatious gala. We chose instead to return to our roots. We walked through the heavy wooden doors of a modest local steakhouse situated just a few blocks from the original neighborhood where we first met. The restaurant was completely unpretentious, smelling richly of roasted garlic and seared hickory wood. We requested the quiet corner booth tucked away in the back, shielded from the ambient noise of the main dining room by a low wooden partition. The dim, warm lighting cast a soft glow across the worn leather seats and the polished mahogany table. There were no flashing cameras, no forced speeches, and absolutely no need to project an image of manufactured wealth. For decades, I had maintained a deliberate facade of blue-collar poverty to protect my family, only to watch that secrecy ultimately fail to save our son from his own unchecked greed. Tonight the secrecy was gone, but the desire for simple, honest intimacy remained exactly the same. We sat across from one another, sharing a bottle of robust red wine that required no extravagant price tag to be enjoyed. The gentle clinking of silverware and the low hum of genuine conversation filled the space between us. We were completely insulated from the corporate maneuvering, the federal courtrooms, and the treacherous high society circles that had attempted to completely consume our lives. We simply sat in the comfortable, profound silence that only 40 years of unyielding partnership can build, completely at peace in the immediate presence of one another. When the waiter cleared our dinner plates, I reached down beside my seat and retrieved a thick, dark leather binder. I placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table, sliding it gently toward Evelyn. I did not buy her an imported sports car, an expansive piece of real estate, or a gaudy diamond necklace. Our recent battles had fundamentally proven how completely hollow those material acquisitions truly were. The physical items Kendall and Megan had so desperately coveted had brought them absolutely nothing but ruin and federal indictments. I wanted to give my wife something permanently immune to foreclosure theft or moral decay. I asked her to open the cover. Evelyn unclasped the brass lock and folded back the heavy leather binding, revealing a stack of meticulously drafted legal documents sealed with an official state charter. It was the complete finalized incorporation paperwork for a fully funded educational trust established entirely in her name. I explained the mechanics of the organization without raising my voice above a quiet murmur. I had liquidated a substantial fraction of my logistical dividends to permanently endow the Evelyn Hayes Educational Scholarship. The trust was specifically designed and legally bound to put young black men and women through accredited trade schools entirely debt-free. It would cover their tuition, provide professional-grade tools, and secure paid apprenticeships across the region. We had spent our entire adult lives trying to build a financial fortress for a son who ultimately despised the very work that funded his existence. He had rejected the dignity of honest labor for the fatal illusion of fast money. We could not force Kendall to understand the value of building a life with his own two hands. We could, however, guarantee that hundreds of other young, ambitious people would never have to compromise their integrity to secure a future. The trust would actively recruit from the same working-class neighborhoods where we had started our journey. It was a direct investment in human potential, a concrete mechanism to forge genuine leaders, rather than entitled heirs. I told Evelyn that her steadfast resilience had anchored our family through its darkest trial, and this institution would permanently reflect her enduring strength. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes scanning the precise legal phrasing of the charter documents. She traced her fingertips lightly over the embossed seal bearing her name. For several long minutes, she did not speak a single word. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to completely fade away as she processed the sheer magnitude of the endowment. Slowly, a single tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a quiet path down her cheek. She reached up and wiped it away with the back of her hand, but more tears immediately followed. She wept silently in the warmth of the corner booth. These were not the agonizing tears of a mother mourning the incarceration of her only son, nor were they the exhausted tears of a woman surviving a brutal financial war. She was weeping from a place of profound, overwhelming pride. The vast wealth that had nearly destroyed our family was now irrevocably locked into a mechanism of pure creation. Gregory Whitmore had attempted to burn our legacy to the ground, and Kendall had attempted to sell it for scraps. Instead of watching our life's work turn to ash, we had successfully transmuted it into a permanent force for good. Evelyn reached across the table and gripped both of my hands tightly in hers. Her grasp was absolute and unyielding. We had successfully defended our dignity against every predator who sought to consume it, and we had permanently protected our legacy. We stepped out of the steakhouse into the cool, damp night air. A light autumn rain had begun to fall, slicking the dark pavement and casting distorted, colorful reflections from the streetlights across the asphalt. I held an umbrella over Evelyn as we walked the short distance to our vehicle. The drive home was quiet and deeply comforting, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers providing a steady background to our shared peace. We approached a major intersection near the commercial district, and I brought the car to a smooth stop at a red light. I rested my hand on the steering wheel, casually glancing out the passenger side window. A bright, neon-lit fast food diner sat on the corner, completely devoid of customers at this late hour. Through the rain-streaked plate glass window, I observed a solitary figure working under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. It was a woman wearing a drab, heavily stained corporate uniform, her hair tied back in a severe, messy knot. She was pushing a heavy industrial mop across the greasy tile floor. She paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead, turning her face directly toward the street. It was Megan Whitmore. The woman who had once demanded keys to luxury estates and shoved me into the mud was now serving out her court-ordered financial restitution, utterly trapped in the grueling reality she had once believed she was too important to acknowledge. She looked exhausted, broken, and entirely alone. There was no glamour, no elite society, and absolutely no escape from the relentless grind of her minimum wage existence. I watched her drag the heavy mop back into the bucket. The traffic light turned green, casting a bright emerald glow across the wet dashboard. I did not say a single word. I simply pressed the accelerator and drove on into the night. Exactly 365 days had passed since the heavy gavel fell in that federal courtroom, sealing the ultimate fates of the predators who had sought to consume my legacy. I stepped out onto the solid wooden planks of my front porch, the aged timber groaning softly under my weight. The neighborhood was enveloped in a profound, uninterrupted quiet. There were no flashing police lights, no frantic knocks from desperate relatives, and absolutely no looming financial threats hovering over my property. The early morning air carried a crisp, biting chill that signaled the definitive arrival of autumn. I lowered myself into the sturdy rocking chair I had repaired with my own hands decades ago, resting my forearms on the smooth wooden armrests. I held a thick ceramic mug filled to the brim with bitter black coffee. The steam rose in slow, twisting ribbons, dissipating into the cool atmosphere. I watched the golden sunlight slowly crest the rooftops across the street, painting the dew-soaked asphalt in a warm, steady glow. My breathing was slow and measured. The chronic, suffocating tension that had gripped my chest for over 3 years was entirely eradicated. The phantom logistics empire I had built and subsequently handed over to Marcus continued to thrive, operating flawlessly without my daily intervention. I was no longer a general orchestrating a brutal financial war from the shadows. I was simply a man enjoying the hard-won sanctuary of his own home, reclaiming the quiet dignity of a peaceful morning. The familiar low hum of a postal engine broke the morning silence. The blue delivery truck rolled slowly down the street, stopping precisely at the edge of my driveway. Mr. Henderson, our neighborhood mail carrier for the past 15 years, stepped out and walked up the concrete path. He offered a polite, respectful nod, fully aware of the public turmoil our family had endured over the past year, yet decent enough to maintain a professional distance. He reached into his leather satchel and handed me a thick stack of daily correspondence. I thanked him quietly, placing my coffee mug on the small wooden side table to examine the delivery. Most of the envelopes were standard utility bills, municipal notices, and quarterly performance updates from the educational scholarship trust Evelyn and I had firmly established. I sifted through the mundane paperwork with practiced efficiency until my thumb brushed against a coarse gray envelope buried near the bottom of the stack. I pulled it out, my eyes locking onto the return address stamped sharply in the upper left corner. It bore the stark, unfeeling insignia of the State Minimum Security Correctional Facility. The inmate identification number printed beneath the seal belonged definitively to my son. I held the gray envelope in my hands, feeling the immense physical weight of the communication. For the first 6 months of his incarceration, Kendall had bombarded this address with frantic, vitriolic letters demanding legal appeals, commissary deposits, and immediate bailouts. I had returned every single one of those desperate missives unopened and completely unacknowledged. I had established an absolute boundary, refusing to engage with his toxic manipulation. I ran my thumb along the sealed flap of this new envelope. It felt entirely different. There was no frantic scribbling on the outside, no desperate pleas scrawled across the margins. I reached into my pocket, retrieved my silver pocket knife, and carefully sliced the envelope open. I withdrew a single sheet of lined institutional paper from the gray casing. I unfolded it slowly, bracing myself for the usual barrage of blame entitlement and frantic demands for cash. Instead, my eyes fell upon a remarkably short, restrained message. The frantic, jagged scribbles that had historically characterized Kendall's handwriting during his panic attacks were completely absent. The words were written with a slow, deliberate neatness projecting a profound sense of newfound discipline. I read the sentences carefully, absorbing the fundamental shift in his reality. Kendall did not ask for a single dollar for his commissary account. He did not beg for a high-priced appellate lawyer, and he completely abandoned the exhausting narrative of framing himself as the innocent victim of Gregory Whitmore's schemes. He simply wrote to inform me that he had officially completed a rigorous vocational certification program within the prison's industrial workshop. He detailed his daily routine, explaining how he now spent 8 hours a day measuring, cutting, and sanding raw timber. He proudly described his final examination project, stating that he had successfully built a functional, sturdy oak chair using nothing but fundamental hand tools and raw physical labor. He noted the deep blisters on his palms and the persistent ache in his shoulders, acknowledging the physical toll of the work without a single note of complaint. There was an undeniable quiet pride woven into his description of the finished chair. The staggering irony was brilliant and absolute. The man who had once scoffed at my greasy coveralls, who had desperately chased the hollow prestige of multi-million-dollar shadow loans and stolen diamonds, was currently finding his salvation in the sawdust of a prison workshop. He was finally learning the invaluable grounding weight of honest labor. He was discovering that true value is not inherited or stolen. It is meticulously built with one's own 2 hands. He closed the letter by stating he intended to secure an advanced carpentry apprenticeship upon his eventual release. He did not ask for my forgiveness, nor did he demand an executive position within my company. It was a simple factual update from a man who was actively rebuilding his character from the absolute bottom. The ultimate victory of this grueling financial war was not the spectacular public destruction of Gregory Whitmore, nor was it the utter humiliation of Megan scrubbing greasy diner floors to pay her civil restitution. Those were simply the necessary mechanics of justice. The true, enduring triumph was entirely contained within this single sheet of lined paper. I had successfully shattered the toxic, parasitic illusion that had thoroughly poisoned my son's mind. By entirely stripping away his unearned wealth and refusing to shield him from the agonizing consequences of his actions, I had forced Kendall to confront his own profound emptiness. The ruthless, silent adjustment I had initiated was now definitively complete. I had not destroyed my son. I had systematically dismantled the arrogant fraud he had become, allowing the foundation of a decent, hard-working man to finally emerge from the rubble. I carefully folded the lined paper along its original creases, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly. I unbuttoned the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat, tucked the envelope safely inside, and fastened it shut near my heart. I picked up my ceramic mug from the side table and brought it to my lips. The neighborhood remained perfectly still, bathed in the growing warmth of the morning sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark liquid. The initial sharp bitterness of the black coffee rolled across my tongue, a harsh reminder of the severe trials we had endured. But as I swallowed, that familiar bitterness steadily gave way to a rich, complex, and deeply sweet, lasting finish. The ultimate victory of this grueling financial war was not the spectacular public destruction of Gregory Whitmore, nor was it the utter humiliation of Megan scrubbing greasy diner floors to pay her civil restitution. Those were simply the necessary mechanics of justice. The true, enduring triumph was entirely contained within this single sheet of lined paper. I had successfully shattered the toxic, parasitic illusion that had thoroughly poisoned my son's mind. By entirely stripping away his unearned wealth and refusing to shield him from the agonizing consequences of his actions, I had forced Kendall to confront his own profound emptiness. The ruthless, silent adjustment I had initiated was now definitively complete. I had not destroyed my son. I had systematically dismantled the arrogant fraud he had become, allowing the foundation of a decent, hard-working man to finally emerge from the rubble. I carefully folded the lined paper along its original creases, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly. I unbuttoned the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat, tucked the envelope safely inside, and fastened it shut near my heart. I picked up my ceramic mug from the side table and brought it to my lips. The neighborhood remained perfectly still, bathed in the growing warmth of the morning sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark liquid. The initial sharp bitterness of the black coffee rolled across my tongue, a harsh reminder of the severe trials we had endured. But as I swallowed, that familiar bitterness steadily gave way to a rich, complex, and deeply sweet lasting finish. True power does not reside in the mere accumulation of material wealth, but in the unwavering enforcement of personal boundaries. When we shield our loved ones from the natural consequences of their actions, we strip them of the opportunity to develop authentic character. Financial empires can be seized, burned, or easily manipulated by greedy hands, but dignity must be painstakingly forged through accountability and hard work. Breaking a toxic cycle requires immense courage and the painful willingness to let those we love hit absolute rock bottom. Only from the ashes of entitlement can genuine redemption and enduring strength finally emerge. What would you do if you discovered your loved ones were taking advantage of your sacrifices? Share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories, and join the conversation today.